Hello friends, this is Odds, and today I'm going to do my best to explain and discuss my reasoning behind the latest killer tier list that I put together. Is for patch 5.60, the very latest patch at the time of recording this. And again, a little disclaimer, some of the killers are very noticeably stronger than others, but that doesn't mean that the weaker killers are bad. Please do not use this list as an excuse not to try or play the lower tier killers, because all of them are still fun and have something unique and fun to them, and they can all do really well with the right mindset and the right skills. Now, with that out of the way, almost more important than the killer placement itself is the rules for your tier list. Some people will make killer tier lists with no add-ons in very sterile conditions that I don't think are realistic, and some people will make tier lists for competitive tournament level play, which is fine, but I also don't think it's very realistic. My tier list has this set of rules. It's on PC, it's ranking killers based on their ability to win, and we consider winning 3 kills or so. And not exactly how you win. We also consider all of the potential maps, any perks available, and also consider all the add-ons. Obviously, the more common add-ons we consider a little bit more. We're going to be assuming that you're playing against a mix of normal solo players, but also groups, which are in comms, with the usual perks, the normal loadouts that you're going to see a lot, and assuming that you yourself are very good at the killer. You don't play them like a robot perfectly, no one can do that, but you play them really good. And we're assuming that your opponents are also, at least on average, decent. Now, if we agree on this, then we can begin to discuss the killer tier list. I'm going to break down the rules even further in these notes right now, if you want to take a minute to read through them, just so that we're exactly on the same page. But other than that, let's go over and show you the tier list. This is the tier list. You can now pause the video and tell me why I'm wrong, and I'm going to summarize it super quick before we delve into each individual killer and talk very briefly, I'll try, into about what makes them good, bad, and everything else. So, 27 killers, 3 of them in the S tier. These are killers that have insane potential in chase, with typically some very high mobility behind it that allows them to keep up even in large maps, and add-ons that typically just boost these to an unhealthy degree. Later in the A tier, we have very strong killers that may or may not have very oppressive powers as well, but that do not excel as much in chase, or have typically one or two tiny downsides that makes them a little bit less consistent but equally powerful at the right times. In the B tier, we have killers that do not stick out quite as much because their add-ons are very average or the powers are not as oppressive, but they almost all have one niche scenario or situation where they are very good, and in the right hands at the right times, these killers can feel really powerful, or at least do their one niche thing really well. On the C tier, we have killers that don't have quite as much love, their add-ons don't scale very well, or they have very obvious weaknesses against common perks or in common maps, and they maybe struggle a little bit more, but still they are fairly powerful, and even if they don't stick out as much as the others, they can still be a force to be reckoned with if you understand what makes them strong and stick to doing that. On the D tier, we have a few killers that are not that far from C tier, but they do have a very slow setup, or very many difficulties when it comes to closing the deal and ending chases because of this slow star or lack of chasing power. But still, they are fun, and some of their add-ons are okay and can be their saving grace. So that is the very quick summary of the entire list, but now we're gonna go one by one into each of these. And of course, we start with the S tier, and the number one always has been, probably always will be, is the Nurse. The Nurse has an enormous skill ceiling, a bit of decision making for sure, but mostly when it comes to landing her blinks, which is her ability to teleport through the map and through objects. Of course, this ability alone already kind of breaks the flow of the game and breaks every conventional chase mechanic. Windows are a suggestion, breaking pallets is completely optional, yada yada. Yes, good survivors will break line of sight, they'll use cheeky dead hearts here and there, but ultimately the Nurse has so many powerful abilities at her disposal, and for some reason she has been receiving buffs lately that are really hard to understand. Number one, her add-ons are extremely good. Some serviceable browns, then yellows that can be good, greens that are stupid good, a few purples that are really powerful, and now she has an iridescent that gives her a third blink with a penalty that you can mitigate, but a third blink, that is just way too much. At almost any level, Nurse has really good add-ons, and her ability to just go through objects means that she's very independent of the map that she plays in. In almost any map, different floors, different obstacles, fences don't really mean much to her. As long as she can see or guess where you'll be, you're gonna go down. And how exactly you go down is also largely unpredictable. Her ability to do basic attacks out of her power means that she's really good with insta-down perks. She also defends hexes and makes use of all the hexes extremely well. Passive and conventional slowdown from Pop, Corrupt, No Way Out works just like a charm. Information perks, especially auto-reading perks that other killers don't use super well, are extremely powerful on her. As a result, Scorch Hooks are really useful on her as well. Even odd builds that other killers cannot use very well, like Starstruck with Agitation, are really powerful on her. She has so many ways to be powerful that not only are you going to get slapped by nurses more often than not, you will not know exactly what build they're going to be using until they've had a chance to show it off. So she's just so powerful in so many different ways. There are two things worth talking about. One of them, they recently corrected apparently a bug or a feature that made her a bit frustrating, and now she's as a result stronger. So in the past, when Nurse blinked, sometimes you would want to hit the mouse button as soon as humanly possible to give as little time to react to the survivors as possible, so that if they're trying to go around the corner or use a dead hard, they do not get to do that. But and I'm sure you've had this happen to you, if you press the button to attack a little bit too early, the attack wouldn't come out. And sometimes you would teleport in front of a survivor, attack, and nothing would happen. And it was a bit frustrating. So it actually was quite difficult for a Nurse to consistently teleport and attack at the perfect frame to make the attack come out as soon as possible. But they've changed this. Now, if you attack mid-air, the Nurse will do the attack as soon as possible, as soon as it's available. So that little bit of difficulty and skill is now gone, and it's just completely easy for any Nurse to do just that. On top of that, there is currently a bug that makes her range add-ons better than they're supposed to be. Her range add-ons are arguably one of her best add-ons already. Some people would argue her best add-ons. They just allow her to teleport even further and have insane mobility and control over the map. Well, for some reason, some old feature has creeped back into the game, and now when the Nurse uses a range add-on, she gets there at the same speed, which means that in practice she's faster. She has the old Omega Blink feel to her. So assuming that this bug gets corrected, she's number one. But as long as this bug is not corrected, she is number one by a long shot. That's all there is to Nurse, really. Next up is our second killer, Blight. Now, Blight released in a rocky state with a weird FOB and some flicks and whatnot that were patched out. But slowly he's been settling into the meta, and also much like Nurse, he's been also recently buffed for some very insane reason. So his skill ceiling is one of the highest in the game. Not only do you need to have the mechanical know-how to do certain complex moves and quick sequences of rushes and hits. His power allows him to move very fast around the map and then hit you at the end. He doesn't insta-out, but he doesn't need it, because once you're hit, he's going to catch up very quickly. Unlike most of other killers, he catches up in seconds, and the hold forward strat is not really effective against him at all. Even big maps are not a big deal, and he's one of the few killers that consistently in tournaments slaps survivors, even good survivors, in maps that other killers would have a nightmare, a really bad timing. So very, very strong in that regard. High skill ceiling, not only mechanically, but also in terms of knowledge. You need to know the maps. Some maps have surfaces that are predictably made of butter, and you can collide with them. And just you don't collide with them and you just glide around. Some people think that maps like Swamp are really bad for Blight, but in reality, when you know what you're doing, you use this knowledge as a part of your arsenal, and you can do all kinds of crazy glides and attack from different angles. You can even do this in many normal structures by bumping into a wall and then walking inside it so that the hitbox doesn't detect the wall, and then you can glide around them. So there are different techniques that allow Blights to be really fearsome in most structures that are not super one-sided for survivors. His add-ons also scale tremendously well. His brown add-ons are unremarkable, but anything from yellow to iridescent, you have a wide selection of insanely strong add-ons, and they are also unpredictable. He could read your aura when he bumps and see exactly where you are and what you're doing behind a wall, or he could just be 10% faster every Blight rush, or he could just break pallets almost immediately, or he could insta-down you with his final rush, or he could also break pallets and recover very fast with the combination of an iridescent and the green bile. It gets silly. It gets really silly, and you as a survivor need to play extremely well, use your strongest perks, split up, and do everything right, and it's very challenging. The recent buff that is worth mentioning is the Adrenaline Vial, which some people would now consider to be his best add-on. This used to be a meme add-on that made him hard to control, but gave him extra buffs. Now his hard to control part has been basically changed, and he controls almost the same. He gets 2 extra rushes, so he can just keep going forever, which is absurd. He gets his power back so quickly that it's honestly inescapable at times. And on top of that, he also gains speed with a single add-on. And not only that, the changes that this add-on does to his controls apparently has allowed some really good Blights to now do flicks again that were until now impossible. So when you consider all of those little tricks that people come up with, when you consider that big maps are not a big deal, that pallets can be eviscerated with some add-ons and dealt with rather quickly without, and that he uses perks that are currently in the meta pretty damn well, yeah, Blight is probably number 2. Next up is Spirit, and this one is a little bit harder to argue. You could totally make the point that she is instead of bottom of S, top of A, and that would be okay. Now, Spirit, quick history recap, used to be a lot stronger, arguably tied for number 1 in many cases, because she had no animation when she vaulted, so she had free mind games. When she stood still, she could be charging her power, or she could just be standing still. So sometimes you stood still on a pallet and survivors had to guess and vault into you, so you got free hits from free mind games. And also she had collision, so if she used her power and went through you and she bumped into you, she would feel you, so she could just hit you. So all of those things and her very obscenely powerful add-ons made her really powerful. Does she have the same skill ceiling as Nurse and Blight? No, but you could always just listen really well with your good headset and maybe put on Strider so that Iron Will players can still be heard, and then you would have very little counter. And even in the larger, most safe map, she was still very decent because she could occasionally use her power from ability. So she was a very all-terrain goddess of destruction kind of killer. Now, some of these things have changed. She now has an animation when she vaults. She now no longer has collision during her power. And when she starts her power, you have an audio cue letting you know that she's going and roughly her direction. So these free mind games don't work as much. On top of that, her add-ons were reworked. She now has a bunch of maybe 5 or 6 add-ons that are completely worthless that you will never use or see. And most of her really strong green add-ons have been reworked. And they no longer exist. However, does that change so much? In reality, no. Her strongest add-on, an iridescent Mother Daughter ring that makes her super fast, is still basically untouched. She now has a new purple add-on that allows her to detect survivors with killer instinct. And this already is a huge deal. Because when you see a spirit stand still, you don't know how fast she will be, because she's invisible, and you don't know which add-on she has, and also you don't know what you should be doing. If you stand still to try to be quiet, she could have the add-on to detect you, and then just hit you. So the agreed upon strategy against her is to just be lucky and guess what add-on she has, and try your darnest to make sure she doesn't hear every little thing you do. So survivors, even though they don't have as much of a hard time as before, they still play, in practice, they still play really badly against Spirit. And even good survivors are induced into making silly mistakes because so many parts of the chase are just up to luck or up to her guessing and up to you guessing, her guessing of your guessing. So ultimately, she's very, very difficult to play against. Her strongest add-ons are absolutely atrociously powerful, and even her lower tier add-ons, yellows and greens and browns, are decent, and they're decent enough that sometimes you will not know which ones you're going against. And trust me, for some reason, even though you don't see as many spirits as before, when you do, they typically bring very strong add-ons, and when you don't, you're going to assume they do, so you will end up mind gaming yourself. Fairly strong, and depending on how good your headset is and how willing you are to learn patterns and listen, even though Strider was changed and now you no longer can use it to counter Iron Whale, you will still beat most teams and end most chases with relative ease with Spirit. And if you're ready to use her strongest add-ons, that's what makes her really, really powerful. Next up, we're moving down a tier and we face the Hag. Now, the Hag I would have considered some time ago even higher, maybe up there with the girls in the S tier. Now I think is a little bit lower. Some of the changes that have made this this way. Borrow time was changed some time ago and no longer applies inside Terror Radius. So before with Hag, you could hook a survivor, be a defensive killer, which is what she does best, and then teleport back and hit the hooked survivor when they come out, and they would go down. And even if they have decisive, maybe you still have traps around. So it was really, really bad. Borrow time now works across the entire map for 12 hooked seconds, so that is a big counter. We also have boon totems. Now, boon totems provide an area where survivors can run back to and heal themselves relatively fast. And this is kind of what happens in tournaments. In tournaments, Hag is really, really difficult to play because, number one, survivors are great at chase, so they're not going to go down easily. Anytime they take a hit, they're going to run back to the start where they know they're safe, and they're going to heal themselves or each other. And they will never give you a down. And if you never have a down, then you don't have anything to defend, and you're not an active chaser. So it's really hard for Hag to keep up with these survivors. So in tournaments, matches can go for 20 minutes, and Hags have a really hard time unless you really have an element of surprise. These days, anyway, survivors have figured out that that's how you play against her. Luckily for you, even though boon totems are a thing, and sometimes survivors do regroup, in a normal game, these things don't happen nearly as much. The skill ceiling for Hag is really not about mechanical aiming or timing. It's more about strategical thinking, and in that regard I think it's fairly high. Her add-ons are excellent. You have browns that are really, really good, yellows that are straight upgrades, and greens that are straight upgrades to the previous ones. So green add-ons and you are absolutely set, with a couple other higher rarity add-ons that can be very disgusting, particularly the Rusty Shackles, which makes her traps silent and can fool so many survivors, and you can get away with doing so many disgusting things. The average group of survivors is not ready for this. You load into the game, and if survivors immediately realize that it's a Hag and harass you well, then it's going to be difficult. You might not know what to do. You might crumble under the pressure, and it feels pretty bad. But in most games, this doesn't happen. Survivors don't realize immediately that you're a Hag. You set up a few traps. If one of them harasses you, you know more or less how to throw them off. You know how to bait them into doing something silly and ignore them when you need to ignore them. You set your early perimeter. Eventually, a survivor steps on it, they get a hit, or you find one of them in the wild and you push them into your perimeter of traps. And in public matches, I'm sorry, this just happens so often. You chase from the right, they go to the left. You chase from the left, they go to the right. It's very, very uncommon for survivors to be on comms and to have the foresight to understand which areas of the map you've been to and which they should avoid. And for the most part, they'll give you your first down fairly easily. And when that happens, it's typically downhill from there. You hook them, you trap around them, and the game plays itself. If you want to play extra dirty, you take advantage of her very, very strong add-ons. You take advantage of the fact that she doesn't need perks very much. She doesn't need to go around the map kicking pallets or kicking gens. You can just put passive slowdown perks like Corrupt and Deadlock, maybe even have Annoyed or some other utility perk to help your lethality a little bit. She becomes really, really powerful. And these add-ons help a lot. And eventually, most teams crumble fairly easily. Because you don't actively go out and chase too much, because you can teleport across floors, maps are not really a huge deal. Even really bad maps with very strong loops can be largely ignored. In fact, her worst maps are the very big open maps like Rotten Fields, where she doesn't really have a great grasp of which paths survivors will take. And even those you can learn how to play. And even matches where survivors bring a flashlight or a medkit, you can learn how to deal with this. If you have the patience to do that, in your average public matches, you're going to be absolutely dominating, even in the roughest conditions. And even if you're losing, you can still make a comeback with a tiny mistake they make. So, in my opinion, Hack easily belongs in here in a public match setting. Admittedly, much weaker when you play against people that are using wounds, that are very conscious about their placement and their strategy. Also, if you fail to set up before Survivor begins to harass you a lot. But luckily for you, that will not be happening so often. Next up is Artist. And Artist is a really interesting killer. My placement here, you could argue, is generous. You could definitely be going down a couple spots. This is assuming that you are absolutely taking advantage of every single thing in her kit and her insane potential. And Artist, if I had to describe her in one word, it is potential. If you are accurate or lucky with your bird shots, this killer is insane. Her skill ceiling is crazy high in every way imaginable. Decision making, timing, aiming, everything about her needs to be on point. And the better you are with her, you're going to see crazier and crazier results. So number one, she's basically a normal killer with normal speed. So anything a normal killer can do, she can do as well. And then on top of that, she has the ability to send out birds. From afar, these birds are not a huge threat. You hit a survivor from afar, they get rid of the birds, and if they do it fast enough, they are lucky. If they don't do it fast enough, maybe you can shoot a second volley of birds, and then that can injure or even down. They can also use flashlights to remove birds from each other or remove static birds near you, and they can also hop into a locker to get rid of them immediately. So from afar, you're more of a killer that gathers information and harasses survivors. But considering how easily and how free you can do this, that's still a big deal. You will occasionally hit people on gens by losing 1 second of your time and force them to do nothing for 8 seconds or longer, which is awesome. And this pairs extremely well with information perks. If you have an information perk like Tinkerer, you know where to send your birds to do maximum damage. And if you have a perk to block away generators passively like Deadman Switch, you can send a bird, and if they let go, Deadman Switch blocks the gen. And if they don't let go, well, then that they take the damage and they also let go of the gen, so it also gets blocked. So all of these things considered, Artist has nice control over wide generator spreads in almost any map, which is awesome. But her real power comes from when she's up close, and when she's up close, she is basically unstoppable in any given loop. If you are in a single loop, the Artist can place 1 or 2 birds and completely shut down all of your options, which means that if you stay there, unless you get lucky or use some crazy dead hard, and even then she has an add-on to make you exhausted in chase, she will most likely hit you. And this is incredible. In maps that are incredibly dense or have incredibly safe palettes like the game, 1 bird and you completely change that. So it really forces survivors to play differently. Unfortunately for you, the most viable strategy against all of this is to just hold forward. So survivors will constantly simply just pretend to loop a single area and then go to the next loop and then repeat until you catch up. And this is where the skill of the Artist needs to be tested. If the Artist keeps setting birds one by one, keeps playing a 1D chase or 2-dimensional chases, then it's not going to work out. If you're smart, then you immediately catch on to this fact. You start to play differently. You hit them with a single bird and then now go for another single or double bird to injure. And if you do this right, you are still very, very oppressive. Maps that are indoors are difficult for survivors. Maps with certain structures are difficult for survivors. The only maps that are really, really tricky for her are the really wide ones, the really large ones, where survivors just hold forward and it's a little bit difficult. And then it's when you need to use your very strong perks to help combat and help know where you should be spending time. But if you do all of that and you play her flawlessly, I do think that she's pretty damn good. Many bad maps for the killers are fine for her. Her skill ceiling, as we said, is really high, and her add-ons are interesting. At first glance, they all appear to be terrible, or they all appear to be very subtle. But once you play her enough and understand her power enough, you realize just how strong half a second is, and half a second of this here, and how all of that adds up. So even though her add-ons are, by all means, not incredibly powerful and busted like some of the other killers above her, she does get help in the things she needs the most, and she's pretty good at that. Survivors do have a bit of counterplay. They can try to tank birds for each other. They can try to hop into lockers, use flashlights, and so on. But even all of this, I don't consider to be like super consistent and super easy for survivors to bully you in any way. If you play artist and you dedicate a lot of time to her, you will most likely agree that she belongs somewhere here in the tier list. Next up is Oni. Now, Oni hasn't had a lot of changes recently. He did have some of his add-ons updated. But none of them have really, some of them buffed, some of them nerfed, but none of them have really knocked him out of position as a very decent, strong killer. He's a normal killer with normal stats, normal chasing, normal lunge, until he collects enough blood, and then he unlocks his real power, which is the Blood Fury. This gives him insane mobility, moves at 200%, and the ability to break pallets almost immediately, insta-down, and even do multiple hits. Overall, his skill ceiling is off the charts. First of all, you need to be a very good normal M1 killer to make sure you get your hits early. That is his biggest weakness. An early game where survivors just pre-drop pallets and stay safe. So you need to be very good at little mind games and decision making to get your first hit. And once you have your power, you need to be even better, because his power allows him to do a lot of insane things that are not immediately obvious. On top of the normal 90% flick that he can do with normal controls, you can change your DPI and do certain maneuvers with certain inputs to really become unpredictable. On top of this 90% flick and running into walls to delay yourself, you can spam A and D to slow yourself down strategically. You can flick your mouse and then do a certain input to do 180-degree flicks to hit a survivor that just that hard to pass you. So the things that you can do with Oni are pretty insane, and add-ons help to support this pretty well. He's got some serviceable browns. His iridescents are not very good. They're pretty memey. But anywhere from yellow, especially to greens and purples, they do get pretty good, with some of the purples and greens being very strong, allowing him to get more blood early and get into his power more frequently through the match, or making it last longer, or giving him extra speed that makes him even harder to combat and chase. So overall, it's a very explosive killer that can have a really difficult time early on, especially in maps like Cowshed or the game, where survivors are just very happy to drop pallets and it's very difficult for you to mind game anything. But other than that, once he gets his power, the next survivor that you chase is almost guaranteed to go down in mere seconds. The only thing holding you back is very strong structures, maybe a few buildings, that require you to break a couple breakable walls or get rid of a couple pallets before you can do anything. And of course, the second chance perks that survivors will use and abuse against you. You will have the occasional people using Unbreakable if you slug multiple people, and that will be bad. You will have the cheeky survivors using Dead Hard through your power, which will get a little bit annoying. So when he does have his power, he is a bit of a machine, but you need to be careful. You can easily commit to one chase and get absolutely nothing out of it. And unfortunately, some of the perks on the survivor side do help a lot in dealing with him. Slugging people and leaving them on the ground for an extended period of time is now dangerous. People will now go back to the boon areas to heal faster, which will mean less blood for you. And that's if they're not running a medkit in the first place. So you need to be a little bit smart and trusting your perks to control gens and know when to use your power. But if you do that, very serviceable killer, very strong. I think most people argue that he's at least this good, arguably even higher. Next up, we move on to Pyramid Head, aka the Executioner. He is a killer with an extremely high skill ceiling, both in decision making, which you have to do constantly. You have the ability to send people to cages instead of hooking them. if you have tormented them. Sometimes this is the right call, sometimes it's not. Sometimes you need to do it in a way, sometimes you need to delay it. And there's a lot of decisions that come with that, on top of having a power that is very powerful, but also very difficult to use consistently. So his power is the punishment of the dam, which allows him to do an airway ground attack that can hit multiple survivors. Needless to say, this is really powerful in unhooking scenarios. If you unhook in front of him, it's basically a guaranteed to hit. And if you uncage in front of him, it's a guarantee 1 down and maybe two. So the unhooking scenarios of this killer are really scary. When you come out of basement, he can actually angle his attack going downstairs, so he can hit multiple survivors in those situations. So the multiple hit ability is pretty good. For the most part, though, you'll be using it on single targets in chase. Any loop that doesn't have a hole, which is basically almost every single loop in the game, that doesn't have any verticality, means that this killer can hit you through it. So much like Audius, people will hold forward and will press E and use Dead Hard to try to delay this, and will pre-draw palace to try to play around this. So it really comes down to how well you can zone survivors, how well you can use your trails to get them tormented as often as possible, and how consistently you can hit them with your power. The really nice thing is that the recovery from punishment is shorter than a normal attack. So if a survivor is cornered in some really bad loop and you hit them with your power, they can't run away. They literally cannot run away. By the time they run away, you catch up and you hit them with another punishment or a normal attack. So sometimes the M2 can lead into another quick attack down in the survivor. And the really nice thing is that even though Pyramid Head cannot use hook perks, he's not going to be hooking survivors as much. So Barbecue is a bit of a bad pick. Pub Goes the Whistle is a bit of a bad pick. Pain Resonance can be a bit of a bad pick. He can still use all the other passive slowdown perks, such as Corrupt, such as Deadlock, such as No Way Out, which only requires 1 hook per each person, which is fine. So all of these perks work really well on him, and in turn, he completely ignores all unhooking perks. So Deliverance, Decisive, Borrowed Time, all these perks can be largely mitigated. And if you do that a single time in a single game, that is typically enough to make a team crumble. So if you're in a map that is not huge, and you send a survivor off in a cage, and you're anywhere near, you're going to guess where that survivor is, and you're going to have the green card, the golden opportunity to tunnel that person out of the game very quickly. And I think that in a normal game, you're going to have survivors that are good, you're going to have survivors that are not so good, but all of them are going to have Dead Hard, and all of them presumably are going to be smart, so they're all going to make your chase power feel a little bit difficult. But not all of them are going to be smart enough and being a team smart enough to actually outplay your ability to tunnel them. And when you do, and you have one person dead on hook at 4 gens or 5 gens, that is really hard to recover from. So if you do that, that alone already makes the Executioner a fearsome killer that will probably do very, very well in an average public game. On top of that, if you want to go a little bit extra on your, do a bit of extra homework to get even better, you can learn other tricks. You can learn the optimal placements of Torment, so that survivors cannot dodge them. You can get better at placing them. You can tinker with different hex builds and slow down passive builds that all work really well, and use your Torment to torment hexes, which is something that he can do, and survivors cannot play around, because if you crouch and do an action, you still get tormented. So he's really good with things like Ruin, with things like Retribution, with things like Pentimento. So hexes are really good on him. And on top of that, you can also learn how to flick, because apparently there's a technique that you can develop where you place your sword looking one way and do an input so that by the time the attack releases, you are facing 90 degrees away from it. And if you do this consistently and well enough, you can basically mind game and hit survivors around loops in a way they're not really ready for, so that your first hit on them is a complete guess, or the first time you do it, you get it down before they know why it even hit you. So considering that you get good at that, considering that you can spend time mastering the geometry and the geography of the map, so that you understand in which angles you can send down your trail at, he becomes really scary. There's many structures where if you do things right and you understand the range of your punishment, you can almost force hits on survivors. And playing against a really good pyramid head, it becomes increasingly obvious. The only thing that's a little bit frustrating about him, of course, is that survivors will hold forward and try to abandon each loop, occasionally vault a window and then just press E and use that hard. In the larger maps, this is a bit annoying. And also sometimes you will just miss by an inch and it will feel a bit like you're just trying to do pot shots and you are really not punished too much for missing. So sometimes the best thing to do with him is just to spam your attack a bunch of times, which can be not so fun sometimes. Otherwise though, really strong killer. The only thing that holds him back, his kill ceiling is really high. Most maps are okay with him. The one thing that holds him back a little bit is his add-ons. His iridescents are pathetic, his purples are a joke. For the most part, you're going to be juggling between some good greens and some almost as good yellows. And that's your bread and butter with this killer. He doesn't have any add-ons that do anything incredible. He is ultimately predictable in his add-ons, with the best ones being very mild improvements of his kit. Possibly the best ones being the range ones that enhance your reach a little bit. So in that department, he's a little bit weaker than some of the other killers. But still, a very fearsome one. Next up is Plague. And much like Oni, Plague is extremely explosive, having moments of slow build-up and also mad stopping power. So Plague basically has two powers, the Green Puke, which is the Vile Purge, and the Corrupt Purge, which is the red. So we'll count them green and red. During Green Puke, she's basically a normal killer, normal terror radius, very tall, so hard to mind game. But she can infect survivors, either passively by puking on an item or having the infection spread between survivors, or actively by puking on them repeatedly, which sometimes is possible and doesn't give them a speed boost. So it's an idea. This will make people infect others and become permanently broken. So the Plague already counters some of the strongest and most common things that you see in Dead by Daylight these days. You load into a game and you hear someone put down a boon and you're playing Plague and you smile and you smirk, you're like, yeah, that's gonna help. And that's awesome. You see 3 medkits and you know that you don't have to deal with them too much, which is great. So the Plague ability, naturally countering medkits and healing boons and so on, is a great asset to her. Her ability to slowly get people infected is great, and she has many great add-ons at every step, some of which enhance this ability and make it so that puking on objects lasts literally forever, so that survivors have a really hard time avoiding it and playing it carefully. And then the real strength of Plague comes when she gets her red puke. And her red puke basically has the same physics, the same mechanics as the green puke, but it injures. And it goes through survivors. Super important. You cannot body block against a Plague. You would be mad to try. If you unhook in front of her, she will do double hits, much like Pyramid Head can. Even if you unblock in front of her and she doesn't have her red puke, she can puke through both of you and infect the two of you at once, fully infect the unhooker even. So her unhooking game is phenomenal. Her chase potential is really high, and also much like Oni, she is very good at downing multiple survivors if they group up, by virtue of hitting multiple of them at once and by virtue of hitting them at a bit of a distance. Now her puke needs to be charged and travels much slower than other projectiles, so survivors need to be a bit smart. They need to crouch behind stuff when you release a short puke. They need to get behind tall loops. They need to dead hard around corners like they would do with Huntress. If they do all of this, you're not going to get free injures. You're not going to get free downs. It's going to require a little bit more work, and some maps, admittedly, are pretty awful. If a survivor runs inside a building in Badham, you don't really have a fast chase anymore. You don't down them in 2 seconds. Whereas if they loop you on a card loop on Autohaven or something like that, you literally hold your puke and they're going to get hit one way or another. So she does render many loops completely useless with her power, and some of those are still decently strong against her. As I said though, her add-ons help a lot. You can have extra fountains to be super aggressive. You can have extra slowdown. She even has a brown add-on that I genuinely think is incredible, that doesn't let you infect survivors directly but makes them injured passively really quickly, and this enables many different playstyles, and all of them are great. Slowdown Plague is good, Hex build Plague is good, Information and passive slowdown is good. Super aggressive auto reading perks are great. Like, you almost cannot, other than some very ill-advised combinations, there are many things you can do with Plague and many builds that work well. If you have Pentimento and you set it up and you puke on it, now survivors have to be slapped with a slowdown. And if they want to get rid of it, well, now they're infected. So all of these things are really difficult to deal with survivors, and most of them don't know how to loop super tight, and most of them don't have the team coordination or even communication to know exactly what to do. Unfortunately, not all is golden for Plague. Sometimes survivors do know what to do, and they will constantly be cleansing in the right spots at the right times. They will make it real difficult for you to get an infection. Sometimes you will puke on a survivor and they'll cough on your screen, but they won't be infected because of silly and stupid netcode issues. If it ever comes to endgame, you will see them all heal up near the end, which can be a bit discouraging. Maybe you will chase 1 or 2 survivors in really good areas where your puke just barely misses them. Sometimes it's something you can make up with skill. Sometimes it's just a tough area, and it's not really your fault. And also, RNG is a big part of her. She has one fountain by default, maybe 2 or 3 with add-ons. And this fountain could be in the middle, neatly prepared for you to come, drink, and down everyone. Or it could also be in the most disgusting corner of the map where you literally have no business going. So that feels pretty bad when your power is held back by a luck-based mechanic. You also have to consider things like if you get stunned, you lose your power, and a few other things about her power. But when you put all of that together and you consider her potential and the fact that her add-ons scale really well and her iridescents are really scary, her purples are decent, her greens are awesome, and she even has a brown meme add-on that honestly can throw survivors off a lot. Yeah, she's pretty great, and I would say she's safely in the A tier. The only thing holding her back obviously being RNG elements and the fact that her chase power has some weaknesses. Next up is Huntress. Huntress, I'm sure you know, has a tremendously high skill ceiling, very nice loadout of add-ons for the most part. Yeah, she does have a few add-ons that are very underused and underpowered, but at any stage she has really good add-ons. Decent browns, decent yellows, decent greens, a few strong purples, and an iridescent add-on that insta-downs. Even though she doesn't have 3 hatchets anymore, it's still something that a really good Huntress can use, and the average team is really not often ready for. So add-ons are great. Her skill ceiling is extremely high. When you play against really good Hunters or watch a really good Hunters, you realize just how many places. First of all, you realize that they have very good aim and they're very mechanically skilled, but they also have knowledge. They understand which loops she can throw over and which places she has to play a certain way. So in that regard, she's really powerful. Now comes some of her weaknesses. Unlike some of the other killers that we've covered previously, she doesn't have a super easy time with perks. She cannot use stealth perks as effectively because she has a big lullaby that doesn't go away. She cannot use insta-down perks as effectively because she's a slower killer. And many perks that trigger with basic attacks don't work with her hatchets and so on and so forth. So her builds are, I wouldn't say more predictable, but they are more limited in scope. When you go against a Huntress, you're going to know what to expect a lot more than when you go against, say, a nurse. So for that reason, she does have a bit more difficulty in this, but still she does have decent passive slowdown perks and auto reading perks that are all helpful, and she does have a decent scope, even if it's not as wide as some of the other killers. So she's okay, just not as good. The problem though, her lack of mobility, the fact that she needs to reload, the fact that she doesn't have any amazing stealth options, it does make playing her a lot harder in many maps. Maps where the lockers spawn in very random areas or have huge dead zones with no lockers can be rough. Maps where every loop is tall can be rough. Some indoor maps can be a bit frustrating for her, such as Larry's. Many large maps just don't go so well. In the past, Hunters used to be able to hit survivors that were repairing generators from afar. And you saw many people use barbecue for this reason. She also used to be able to hit survivors who were healing above their head because their hitbox was like extending. And you saw many people run nurses. But these things have all been changed over the years, and she doesn't get that little bit of help anymore. So you do need to play a lot more accurately. You will realize the very cruel reality of high MMR or high level DBD, where 2 out of every 4 or 3 out of every 4 survivors are running dead hard. And what this means is that the better you become, the more dead hards that you're going to see. So you will play fine. The survivor will make it close to a wall. You will think that you have a down. And even if you aim perfectly or release it perfectly, they'll just dead hard for distance to make it around the corner. And then they'll be fine for the next little bit. So you will find yourself in many situations where through no fault of your own, you need to abandon a chase or accept the fact that it's going to take much longer just because a person pressed E, which counters Huntress quite okay. So in that regard, she's very powerful. She just has a few maps that are a little bit rougher. Her unhooking and basement game are incredibly strong. Unfortunately, you will also be punished quite a bit for missing and for any second chance that the survivors get to pull off on you by virtue of having to reload and so on. Arguably, if you care only about skill and you consider only her best maps, you could say that Huntress could be a little bit higher than this. Ultimately, though, I do have a hard time coping with the fact that she does not counter healing as much as Plague does. She's not as explosive as Oni. She's not quite as she doesn't have quite the potential as Artist. She cannot tunnel sometimes as effectively as Pyramid Head. So ultimately, I think she's a little bit below, but still a very strong killer. Very huge potential if played correctly. Next up is Twins. And honestly, I would have placed Twins at top of B tier, but I think the tier list would have looked ugly. So I'm almost 50% on top of B, bottom of A. Let's talk about the Twins. The Twins on release were a bit messy. A little bit after that, they were patched out, and they were arguably one of the stronger killers in the game. They were very nasty. Victor was really hard to shake off. He's a really strong power that can chase survivors super fast. The skill ceiling to him is not incredibly high. He's rather simple to control and get the most out of. But if a Twins player never misses, and if they hit some mad jumps and angles and bounces, you will tell the difference. So the skill ceiling, while not as high as some of the other killers, is still respectable. And it will almost always result in the survivor that you chase being injured or down, which is a pretty big deal because many other killers don't have anything guaranteed, especially when we delve lower and lower into the tier list, and we don't have killers that have a guaranteed hit anywhere, mind you. So the fact that this power guarantees you a hit almost anywhere very quickly is pretty damn nuts. So Victor as a chasing power is huge, though it's obvious that it's better if you down than if you chase. And with Twins, you could down survivors very quickly and then recover and keep downing and keep injuring, and it was honestly really strong. However, many nerfs came. Ruin and Dying were nerfed, which were some of their strongest perks. Victor now has a huge cooldown. Dead Hard, which Victor could ignore, now can be one of his worst enemies because you can hit a survivor. If they're Dead Hard through, you might sometimes get the hit and then not down them, and then you get kicked in the face. So it is very punishing to have that thing happen. And obviously, boon totems have come out, and boon totems allow survivors to stay healthy. And if they stay healthy, then they can hold on to Victor and kidnap him and keep him for 30 seconds. Whereas if they're injured, they just go down, and that's awesome, right? But even if you do down them, Victor has a very long cooldown of like 7 seconds between you downing and switching to Charlotte. So sometimes when you play Victor and Twins right, it still feels really punishing. And you'll have the occasional match where you have unbreakables and you have the boon that allows people to pick themselves up called exponential. So many things feel geared against the Twins, which honestly sucks. And talking about all of that, you would say, wow, well, the Twins seems pretty bad. So what's the deal? Why are they so high? Well, let's talk about their add-ons. Their add-ons are decent. Iridescence, an iridescent that can be pretty strong. Purples that increases speed a lot. Green that increases speed. A couple browns that are really good for browns. And even though like half their add-ons are really pathetic, the ones that are not pathetic are very good and do make a difference. Especially the Toy Store being a brown add-on is an insane thing, despite it getting nerfed recently. it's still a very decent add-on. So the range of add-ons is really good. Victor is really hard to avoid and works in almost every map. And ultimately, even though playing twins feels really bad, there are two things that are basically in your favor. And one of them kind of leads to the other. Number one, twins is exceedingly rare. Most people playing Dead by Daylight casually get into Hypermar for the first time have played against 3 twins in their lifetime. They have played against twins very little, especially if they picked up the game after the twins release and they didn't see them a lot when they came out. Especially if they picked it up after that, they see twins very little. So you have an innate advantage of survivors having no damn clue how to counter it. Even survivors that have seen twins a lot, and now we're getting to the next point, they do not understand the counterplay to twins. The counterplay to twins is very unintuitive for survivors. In tournaments, what you're going to see is survivors will hold Victor hostage for 30 seconds. They will constantly stay away from Charlotte and constantly run away from Charlotte. If they are far enough, they'll hop into a locker. And if they get in trouble, they will have people come and body block. They typically will work in pairs. And sometimes I've seen survivors injured literally be body blocked by a healthy survivor so that Victor can knock down the injured and instead needs to hit the healthy. If they do all of this and they're well communicated and so on, and especially with some medkits, some healing boons and so on, then twins is actually kind of hard. And in tournaments, they do okay because there's rules against multiple medkits and rules against boons, but they would have a hard time. Fortunately for you, that doesn't happen in normal games. In normal games, no one takes hits for anyone. Until maybe the end game where people are a bit more single focused on the execute, but people don't take hits for others. Often people don't understand the counterplay to Victor. People will drop pallets, not realizing that they're gonna get hit. They will do all sorts of mistakes that will allow you to injure them with Charlotte and then down them with Victor in seconds, or injure them with Victor and then gather information from that and down them with Charlotte, or find someone else, get them off a gen. And you have many perks that are easy to use on twins, passive slowdown perks like Corrupt and Deadlock, to just slow down gens while you do your business. And eventually you're gonna get people down, you're gonna get a couple people injured, and then even though twins is very unpleasant sometimes, there's no denying that they're just really, really strong at handling this. If you have 3 people injured and 1 person on the hook, there is nothing they can do. There's nothing they can do. You can hit someone with Victor, and they are basically unable to do anything. They encamp with Charlotte. They need to constantly look out for these things. And much like Hag, they can find themselves in a situation where everyone is injured, no one can do anything. They try to do gens, but unlike Hag, you can actually send out Victor to scout and down people across the map. And it's a lot easier to guarantee these downs. So when you consider all of that, and you consider the fact that they have a couple add-ons that helps in this regard quite a bit, they scale quite well with rarity, I would say twins is quite okay, even if they're not quite as strong as they once used to be. And that's pretty much all there is to twins. Now moving on to Pinhead, aka the Cenobite, a really interesting killer, for the most part nerfed since released. His add-ons used to be really, really strong, to the point where one of them was one of the most game-changing add-ons in the game. Now it's still strong, but they basically have changed it. Overall, super high skill ceiling in every imaginable way, mechanical skill ceiling, decision making, knowledge of the maps. His add-ons still are fairly strong, even though it's only a few and many of them are useless. The ones that matter are good. And yeah, I would say he is one of the killers that does get screwed over in some maps. The very large maps are hard to keep up with, especially if they're not super open. And some of the indoor maps, using your power effectively is really hard. It's hard to do anything. So basically, this killer has multiple powers. The first one is a passive box that makes survivors have to go out of their way to pick it up if they don't want to get harassed. And then he sends out a chain to slow down survivors. And if he picks up the box, he can also actively fight against survivors and slow down the game himself. The first skill that comes with Pinhead is how much you can find this box. If you're really good at reading the information the survivors give you or using perks at certain stages of the game, you can guess where the box is and straight up go there and pick it up and immediately put survivors in a bind, or guess where it's going to be approximately and keep close to that area so that when someone picks it up, you immediately harass it out of them. For that reason, many builds are viable on Pinhead, and some perks that are not very common on other killers, like Franklin's and Hoarder in particular, can sometimes be used on him, which is kind of cute and it's kind of cool. Ultimately, I would say that you are held back by just the fact that you're a normal killer that needs to hit survivors twice, that in some maps, the pallets are so safe and survivors have such helpful perks that even your decent chasing power is still no match. Or there's indoor maps, so when you hit them with a chain, all the chains break immediately, and if you walk through a chain, you also break it. And also the fact that when they pick up the cube, because there's so many walls and so many obstacles, it's actually impossible for you to harass it and get it out of their hands. So those are your main difficulties: strong perks, strong maps, and just the fact that you don't have any innate ability to like immediately insta-down or immediately punish survivors. And sometimes some things are out of your control. If the box spawns somewhere unpredictable, you're not going to find it. You will chase a survivor, you will pick them up after you down them, and during that pickup, someone picks up the cube, solves it, and there's nothing you can do. And then your secondary power is mostly just a very small slowdown. You also have the games where survivors are silly and they don't pick up the cube and they all die, but those should happen less and less as you climb up the MMR rank and they get better, presumably. So yeah, let's talk about some of his strengths though that are worth talking about. His iridescent add-on, the Engineer's Fang, is perhaps his most notable. It makes his chasing power worse because you only get 2 chances instead of 3, but it literally insta-injures survivors. This add-on used to be super busted. Now it has the downside of giving you worse chasing power. So it's no longer busted, but it's arguably his best. And if you were to dedicate a lot of time to getting good with chains, I think this add-on would be extremely oppressive. You would be like a Legion that can teleport to the cube and that still has some chase power. So if you, and can combo this with other strong add-ons to make up for it. So this killer with that iridescent, if you were really good at him, would be really scary. Even without this iridescent, you have very serviceable add-ons that can do very notable things. One of them makes his chains even better, which is a good straightforward change. One of them shows you the aura of survivors that are chained, which can let you to crazy mind games in loops that are super tall that you would otherwise have no business mind gaming. Awesome. One of them makes survivors go into deep wound. Doesn't seem so good when they're injured. This can completely counter BT. This killer has a purple add-on that if you hit a survivor with BT, that's it. They die. They don't have BT. So he's very good at tunneling if you use this and want to go down that road. So very, very strong potential from some of these add-ons. And the other ones, they're not so good. Some of the best ones were nerfed. Green, yellow, brown. They're not so remarkable. But hey, there's a couple cute things. So overall, decent killer, huge potential if everything lines up. A little bit out of your control sometimes. Even if you are really good at landing chains and chase, sometimes they can just spawn randomly in odd angles, even if you do your best to predict where they'll be. So some things are a little bit outside of your control, and hence that's why he's not much higher in this list. But a very serviceable one, and the better you get with your chains, and the better you understand which angles you can use them in, and the fewer mistakes that you make with your chains, the more potential you'll squeeze out of them. Next up, we have the Cannibal, who is, comparatively speaking to many other killers, a very much simpler character. His skill ceiling is seemingly high. I would say to play Cannibal in a normal way, his skill ceiling is quite low, especially if you're going to be one of the infamous cannibals that just finds one survivor and just camps them from up close. If you're going to do that, then his skill ceiling is obviously not high. But if you're going to play him to his full potential, then his skill ceiling is certainly very, very high. You need to know when to use your chainsaw. You need to know how to loop around things very tightly to get the most out of it and catch survivors in places they wouldn't think you can. And much of this comes from a lot of practice and and understanding the hitbox and shaping around corners very tightly, and also running some of his best add-ons. His add-ons are a little bit weird. Some okay brown, some okay yellow, some decent greens, a cute purple or two. His iridescence, one of them is still bugged and the other one is okay. So his add-on scale okay, but a couple combinations particularly stand out as being by far the best. And without these combinations, I'm gonna say the games are a lot harder. Against good survivors, your normal Chainsaw feels pretty bad. Compared to some other killers that have very established base kits, the normal Chainsaw Cannibal is just not fast enough to surprise survivors in small loops, and it doesn't go long enough to catch survivors in some of the larger ones. So you will feel the need to run certain add-ons to remain competitive. But if you do, then it's fine. Then it's all right. And against average survivors in good maps, then you probably don't even care about add-ons so much. But assuming that you do that, he's okay. He has quite a lot of potential. He can even use his power in certain loops to literally guarantee downs if survivors make the tiniest mistake. Not to mention that he's incredibly good at catching survivors in the open. If he's undetectable and creeps up to you, it's an insta-down. If you go into basement and he's up there, well, good luck. So he handles unhooks really well, unlike other killers such as Artist, which is arguably a better killer than him. If he has a person on the hook, no one's going to even bother to come for the rescue. Because they know that, you know, if you don't make a mistake, they're all gonna go down. So yeah, his unhook scenario is very favorable, and this typically means that if you're gonna get a kill, yeah, that you're gonna guarantee that kill. Some people could argue this is a good or a bad thing because survivors will never give you multiple kills; they'll just leave. But overall, it's a strength to consider. Now we talked about the add-ons. Let's talk about perks. One perk that you almost want to run on this killer is Bamboozle. It feels really bad. I don't think any killer we've mentioned so far needs a perk as badly as this killer sometimes needs Bamboozle. But if you get a set of map with a couple interconnected windows or one very strong window, your power is an absolute joke, and you will need to M1 people. And at that point, you're not much better than an average killer. So very strong Bubbas understand this. They know that they can break pallets rather quickly. They know that they can destroy you in the open, so they're only scared about windows. And they'll come and bamboozle them with this perk and block them. So he's a little bit more predictable than other killers in that regard, and his range of potential builds, I wouldn't say is quite as interesting as some of the other killers. So that just ultimately leads to the fact that he's a bit more predictable. And if you have a big enough map, with good enough maps, with a couple interconnected windows here and there, he has a difficult thing. If he chases you and gets rid of 6 pallets and bamboozles 2 windows and then downs you, but then he loses 3 gens, he's going to lose the game. So as a Baba, it's incredibly difficult for you to do that and get away with it. You need to be chasing multiple survivors. Since he's so good at defending an area, because you cannot do anything in front of him without going down, he exceeds at hooking people next to gens with ruin, pop, whatever, and making those gens regress while he camps or he's in the area or he exerts his presence there. So he really doesn't want to chase one survivor in the middle of nowhere while everyone else is holding gens. And how exactly you achieve this just comes down to good game sense and chasing the one survivor that you think will go down the quickest, but also having perks like Corrupt, Deadlock, to just hold the gens while you do the inevitable chasing that you need to do. Unfortunately, some maps are really not made for him. Maps with very strong buildings that have many windows are difficult. Even maps with lots of pallets, even if he can get through them, can be difficult. And as I said, you are depending a little bit on add-ons and depending a little bit on perks to keep up. Ultimately, though, he's very serviceable, and the very, very good cannibals definitely stand out. And it goes without saying that any mistakes survivors make will immediately and ferociously be punished with an instant down, maybe multiple downs. So he's a killer that in an average lobby where survivors on average make mistakes will do fairly well if you know what you're doing. Be careful though, because your own mistakes will also be very costly. Up next, we have Nemesis. His skill ceiling is fairly high. Unfortunately, part of it comes down to the zombies not getting stuck and finding people, so there is a bit of an RNG to him, despite his actual tentacle power being something you can get much, much better at. The zombies will always be a wild card, sometimes very good, sometimes very bad. His add-ons are all over the place, and I think so far, out of all of the killers we've covered, he might as well just have the worst add-ons. some of them are straight up terrible, and even the good ones are all situational. There are times when you bring zombie add-ons and the zombies do nothing, and times when you bring tentacle add-ons and your tentacle didn't need them, or your tentacle did nothing. So almost any add-on, I would almost say every single add-on on Nemesis has the potential to be either bad or mediocre. All of them, even the really high rarity ones. So that immediately brings him down a notch, despite being arguably stronger than some of the other killers around him. He doesn't really get much help from add-ons. And some of his best add-ons were nerfed recently, which feels really, really cruel. So in tier 1, as a Nemesis, you want to get into tier 2. When you're in tier 2, you, on top of having the zombies, which is a cool gimmick, he actually has very many notable things about him. He needs to hit survivors 3 times. Yes, that is a big deal. But he can do it very quickly. And almost any map will not hold him back. Other than very strong buildings that survivors get an early run into, Nemesis is an absolute machine when it comes to chases. Arguably harder to avoid than almost any other killer from close up. You go through a window, you're gonna get hit. You drop a pallet, you're gonna get hit. You drop a pallet and run away, the pallet gets destroyed immediately. He is the best pallet destroyer in the game, period. He is also the best wall breaker in the game. He can break walls from 5 or 6 meters away, or break them in chase while he walks through them. So he is very, very, very good at dealing with breakable walls on some maps and dealing with pallets and eliminating them right away. The very weak pallets he doesn't even need to break because he can hit you there anyway. And the very strong pallets he can evaporate with his tentacle super, super quick. And that is nuts. On top of that, he can hit you over small obstacles. He can drag his tentacle to pretty much guarantee a hit in tight areas and while you do animation. So even though he has to hit you 3 times, it is a very easy 3 hits. And because he can do it from a distance and has a shorter cooldown than a normal attack, he can also zone you. So much like Pyramid Head, if you're in a corner of the map and you take a hit, yeah, you take a hit, yeah, you get a speed boost, but he doesn't get slowed down too much. And he did it from a position of advantage. So you really will get the second hit almost right away. So those things are awesome about him. And if that was everything, probably Nemi would be maybe not too far from Twins, Huntress, and some of the A-tier killers. Unfortunately, he does have a mechanic called the cases. So survivors at any point can choose to find one of the 4 cases in the map, open it up, and have a vaccine. It takes a couple seconds to open, a couple seconds to administer. Actually, it's 4 seconds and then 2 seconds, I think. And then you reveal your heartbeat killer instinct to the killer when you do that. And when you do that, you remove infection, which means that now he has to hit you 3 times again. When you consider this, it's a bit difficult. It's a bit difficult with Nemi. You hit people a lot with your tier 2. Awesome, you hit tier 3 faster, now you have extra range, but now they start to split up and use the vaccines. You focus on one survivor too much, okay, great, but now you have people doing gens elsewhere, and by the time the end game comes, they're all healthy, you need to hit them, and your tentacle needs to hit them 3 times. So almost anywhere you go with your strategy, you will have potential holes and flaws and counterplay. So it does feel a bit irritating sometimes that so much of that is out of your control, especially when it comes to zombies. Zombies are irritating. In his best maps, they are good. In his worst maps, they can be garbage. They can get stuck in places. Unfortunately, behavior hasn't made some kind of failsafe so that if they get stuck, they unstuck themselves. And they continue to be very mediocre in many aspects. So that can be incredibly infuriating. If you can get past that, though, you have a killer with a serviceable, reliable ability to chase survivors, who is really hard to shake off and who feels really fun to play. So I kind of love him. I really like him. I just wish his add-ons were just a little bit more straightforward. Right now, if you study them, you'll see what I mean by that. Next up is Demogorgon. Demogorgon is no longer able to be purchased, so if you didn't get it before it went out of the store, my condolences. He's a pretty fun killer. He doesn't really stand out as being the best at anything, and in fact, his major strength comes from the fact that he's good at many things, kind of, and has several abilities going on at once. A very decent skill ceiling. You will need to place portals to teleport around the map and also use your power to shred pallets and hit survivors. And when to do all of that and when to do certain other little tricks that he has come with time. The really good Demogorgons understand that they can launch themselves from high places to gain distance, and they also understand that some things in the map don't have collision, so they can actually hit around certain obstacles and glide around them at dizzying speeds, which is awesome. So there's definitely a skill that comes with Demo, and you will get slapped by his shred around corners in unpredictable ways when you play against a really, really good Demo. So he's really awesome in that. Unfortunately, he's just average in most other regards. His skill ceiling, as you said, is fairly high. His add-ons are actually fairly good. They got reworked, and many of them affect things like the teleporting through portals that you don't really care about, but the few that do matter are good. There is a decent iridescent and a couple other add-ons that are decent sprinkled throughout. So at almost any rarity, you have something good to go for. And some of his lower rarity common add-ons are very, very respectable. So he's okay when it comes to add-ons. And when it comes to maps, that is a little bit harder. Some maps are just really safe. And if survivors have a few extra helping hands in chase and they drop a few pallets, it can be rough. No map is too big for him because of his portals, but his portals ultimately don't give him much helping chase or anything like that. So yeah, some interesting build variety that you can have with him. His portals can be used to defend hexes. He can obviously make use of info perks and react to them across the map with portals. So there's a bit of variety in his builds, which is awesome. He also uses Save the Best for Last quite well. So there's a few things you can do with him, which is great. But I guess ultimately his weakness comes from the fact that his shred doesn't insta-down. And you will just be at the mercy of how big and how safe the map is for survivors. If you hit a couple and they have a medkit, well, you're not gonna get any shortcuts into the next chase. If they have a boon totem, you're gonna suffer looking for it. If they're in one of these maps where pallets are just so safe that they kind of just play themselves, you're gonna be in a bit of trouble. Ultimately, he doesn't have any it's much harder to mess up against a Demogorgon than it is to mess up against many other killers. So even a mediocre survivor that makes just a couple bad plays can still outplay you just based on the fact that they press E at the right time, or they are willing to drop enough pallets and be carried by some other perk later on. So when you consider all of that, I would say that Demogorgon is just okay. It's just alright. And yeah, we're gonna move on to the next one. If I have a feeling I have forgotten something about Demogorgon, so I'm just gonna take a little break and revise my notes and see if I forgot anything remarkable before I wrap him up. Alright, the only thing I recall missing to mention is the fact that Demogorgon does have a component of stealth when he comes out of his portals. I suppose that's worth mentioning, which can be enhanced with a few add-ons, but you'll find that the add-ons that enhance that and his portal traveling are mostly useless, and anything that you want to focus on Demo for the most part is just shredding through pallets quicker and shredding through survivors faster and getting to them a little bit more consistently with your shreds. That's the add-ons that matter. Ultimately, he's just an average killer in that regard, and I guess that's why I'm struggling to end on any particular note. But yeah, that's Demo for you. Next up is Deathslinger. Deathslinger got hit by a pretty significant nerf since the last tier list. In a prior tier list, Deathslinger would have been a 24 meter terror radius killer, who is slower than average, 110% compared to 115, but that could instantly spear survivors. You could aim and shoot basically immediately, and then reel them in and hit them. He's been changed. I don't think this was really addressed as a nerf, more like a change to make him more fun, but overall it is a bit of a nerf. His terror radius is now 32 despite being slower, which means that with monitor abuse or without monitor, you're not going to get many surprise approaches on survivors. So in the past, you would just walk the survivors working on gens and get a free hit on them or a free down if they were injured, and that was awesome. That's just not something that's going to happen very frequently anymore. And on top of that, he needs to be aiming his gun for a little bit less than half a second, 0.4 seconds before you can shoot, which means that survivors can now react, which means that survivors can now have more room, and which means that you have less room to make decisions, and you have to commit to them a little bit earlier, and you cannot wait until the very last second. And also means that they can dead hard on reaction. But you're also faster while you hold your gun, so you can fake it a bit more convincingly. It is true that your terrorist is now bigger, but you now also recover a little bit quicker from breaking your chain, if that's something that needs to happen. And some of these add-ons, I would say, are a little bit better. So his skill ceiling right off the bat is very, very high, especially when it comes to landing the first shot that will injure survivors. You can hit survivors from really far distances. I think it's 18 meters range. Is that right? Yeah, 18 meters, I believe. And even if it's through some tiny hole or across floors, if you hit them, they will be injured. And sometimes if the path is clear enough, you can sometimes reel them in for a hit. And if obviously they were already injured, they'll be now down. If they break the chain, you recover faster as well. And if they do so, or if you hit them and they don't go down, they now have to mend. The mending part is actually kind of a nice thing. It's one of the few killers that can do that by default. It means that if a survivor has a medkit, they cannot begin to use it right away. It means that if you let them go, they cannot just go and heal in a boon immediately. They have to first mend, which is awesome. It doesn't come very often because this is a killer focused on the 1v1. But when you do have to use these medkits and have to let go of a survivor as a killer, I think these seconds add up. So I guess that's okay. And on top of that, we have the fact that his add-ons now have been improved slightly. Some of his staple add-ons like the faster reload are still good, miss cooldown still decent, but now we have add-ons that work much better when you break the chains, and a couple ones that are really really interesting. Mostly the iridescent one, the iridescent coin that allows you to instant down survivors. With this add-on, this killer is actually really scary. This add-on got buff, and now you can instant down survivors from 12 meters. 12 meters is very easy to get hits. Not consistently, not all the time, but during on hooks, during certain plays, like it's easy enough. It's easy enough to make it worth missing a few shots in a normal game if you bring that. So with the iridescent coin, this killer is actually really, really scary. Every add-on after that has a few more buts, and it has a few more ifs, has a few more downsides or limited usability. So his add-ons are okay-ish, with that one outlier being particularly strong, in my opinion. Then when it comes to maps, you don't really care so much about pallets and loops nearly as much as other killers. Almost anywhere you can get a hit if your aim is on point. You will obviously suffer if you miss many shots, or survivors get particularly lucky. The problem though is the fact that you need to down, you need to reload, you need to pick up, you need to hook, then you need to walk to the next gen. You're a little bit slower than other killers, so on average it's going to take a little bit longer. When you consider all of that, it's not really loops that hurt him, it's big maps. You cannot be messing around. If you go to a big map like Eerie, and you have a hard time finding your first survivor because they hide or whatever, remember, you're not going to catch them off guard with your terrorists as much as before. And then they set up a boon and you need to try and find it, and then you lose as well. You cannot have any missed time. You need to be chase after chase after chase after chase. Reel your survivor towards a certain gen. Hook them closer to it. If you're not constantly in chases, you will lose games so very often. His 1v1 is very good. His unhooking is definitely not as remarkable as some of the other killers. You will have survivors constantly run into you to break the chain for their teammates. But still, he's decent. His endgame is also decent, and he does use a few perks a little bit better than other killers because he reels survivors towards himself and hits them. He can use Search / Jolt. He can use instant down perks quite well. Those are some of the best. And ultimately, even though he's quite average and doesn't stand out for being a semi-stealth range killer, you can make up for that with some of his strongest add-ons, and mostly being extremely consistent with your shots. If you are, then his 1v1 eventually generates enough pressure for the 1v4, and then you keep up with survivors. That's really his one strength. The fact that no amount of shacks or no amount of jungle gyms can keep a survivor from you, basically. But that's pretty much it for Deathslinger. And considering some of the later maps that we have nowadays, and the fact that he would benefit from having people injured, but boons and medkits are still a thing, even if he can play around them a little bit, yeah, I just don't see him being much higher than this. Next up, we have Billy, who's undergone very few changes since the last tier list, as far as I remember. His kill ceiling is extremely high. He's one of the few killers that can naturally insta-down survivors on command from up close, so obviously it goes without saying that he's very good at securing kills if he decides to do that, and very good at catching people in the open. His skill, though, mostly comes from understanding how to use his power around loops. Catching a survivor in the open, yeah, they'll spin a little bit around. A good Billy will eventually get good at hitting those. But survivors will not be in the open all the time. They'll run you around structures. And then it's going to come down to you using your power, not just for the mobility that it gives you, which is also a nice boon, but to curve around structures and to lock survivors out of options and to make every turn they run on a corner a potential insta-down. When you consider the potential that he has to down people really quickly like this, you quickly realize how scary he can be and how difficult it can be for survivors if they have an early down to come back from that. The fact that he has mobility means he can use information perks okay. He doesn't need insta-down perks, he doesn't need many other perks, but his builds are varied enough, I suppose. The add-ons are a bit sad. Hillbilly used to have some really stupid, strong, and all-purpose add-ons. They were changed when he got his overheat mechanic introduced, and they were really bad overall. Now, mercifully, some of them have been changed and adjusted, and I'm happy to say that his add-ons are a little bit better now. The very good hillbillies will argue that you need the engravings, typically the better engraving, because it makes his charging longer, which is bad, but it also makes his chainsaw much faster, which gives him an easier time traversing the map and makes his chainsaw unpredictable enough and fast enough that it's hard to react to it, and that's what enables many of the curves. In my opinion, the whole curbing thing is really fun and interesting when it can happen, but in many maps you just don't even get to do that. Survivors will pre-drop the pallet, survivors will hog windows. This killer also typically runs bamboozle, much like Cannibal. For similar reasons, you want to be blocking windows, because if a survivor has a strong window and they just continue to abuse it, your power is really hard to use, and you are extremely punished for missing. Survivor gets a slap on the wrist, everybody else continues to ingest, you're stunned now for a good 3 or 4 seconds, depending on your add-ons or whatever. Tricky. Very, very tricky. With this killer, if you want to unleash his potential, you need to be ready to perform way more accurately than other killers. You will need very, very on-point inputs, and not only that, you will also need to predict. So if a survivor is going around the corner, you need to both do the curve around it correctly and also predict that he'll be in a certain way or in a certain place, because if you don't, you're going to do it perfectly and you're still going to miss. So you need to add multiple layers of doing things right in your chases as Hillbilly. You need to constantly input things right, but also guess what the survivor is going to do right, and that can be hard. And that's assuming that you're really good and then you have some of the add-ons to help you out. You also have some other purple add-ons like the low pro chains to shred through pallets, which is a really nice addition to your arsenal. But then from there on, his add-ons they just become really sad. They are incredibly situational, or they are stealth add-ons that fail flat on their face at most maps. So his add-ons, I would say, are okay-ish when you just focus on the few that are good and completely ignore the many that are just pathetically bad. If a survivor makes a mistake and you are particularly on point, you're going to down them. If they play really well, I think it's going to be a really good toss, and it's going to largely depend on how. I just realized that I'm staring at the portraits of the killers that I have here. And it must be a little bit strange for you guys too. I guess in my camera I'm looking at the tier list as well. But maybe I should be looking at the camera a little bit more. Forgive me. As I was saying, it's gonna come down to how stacked the map is. In a map like Badham, where buildings and windows are very plentiful, it's very hard to play Hillbilly. In a match like Cowshed, there's a lot of pallets, and you can just drop most of them very safely and decide to play very safely. If you indulge in a bit of risk, that can backfire if the Hillbilly is good, so you're just gonna play safe, and you'll find that unfortunately with Hillbilly you most likely want to bring Bamboozle and play it super safe and just poke around the team until you find the one survivor that is just not super good or is not in a really good spot. So it's a little bit sad to see him down here, but that doesn't change the fact that he's pretty fun to play as and against. So please do not be discouraged from playing Hillbilly, and maybe encourage the developers to give him more fun add-ons with fewer drawbacks or that are less situational. Next up, we have the Trickster. The Trickster is an interesting character. I would say that more so than many other killers, he has very, very insanely pronounced strength and also very obvious glaring weaknesses. It goes without saying his skill ceiling is really high. The difference between a killer that can land most of his knives and one that misses most of them is very big. And it will also show in their approach. So the better you are with Trickster, the better results you'll get very consistently. And I think that if you play him really, really well, he certainly belongs up here. His add-ons, interestingly, are also pretty good, arguably better than many other killers that we've seen lately. All the way from brown, you have some decent ones, some very deceivingly strong yellow add-ons. Greens have some of his best. His purples, from the top of my head, are a bit gimmicky at times, but he's got iridescents that are both very decent. One of them in particular is kind of scary and a bit of a noob stomper if survivors don't see it coming, since it allows you to insta-down. So his add-ons actually elevate him quite a bit, and some of them can make up for his weaknesses quite a lot. So using these add-ons right is probably the first piece of homework that a good Trickster wants to do. Unfortunately, even some of his best add-ons don't change the fact that he's extremely map dependent. Basically, if the Trickster can see you, he can throw knives at you, and if he can throw knives at you, you're gonna go down very quickly. No matter how many rocks and loops are there, if he can throw knives at you, you're gonna go down really fast. If you make the mistake of doing some action in front of him, unhooking, going through a window slowly, breaking up, vaulting over a pallet, anything like that, he has enough time to put enough knives in you to injure you or down you, especially if he has his main event, which is basically double firing rate for a few seconds. And this can make taking hits for other survivors or doing rescues extremely risky. The Trickster is essentially an extremely good defender. Almost as much as any other killer. If a Trickster is in the open and they're guarding a hook and they are good, you will not get that rescue, or if you do, it's going to be at an incredibly high price, with multiple people going down, main event coming in later, and so on. So he's incredibly good at dealing with survivors up close and dealing with multiple of them at that. So he's extremely dangerous then. When he gets a hook in a nasty area that you can't avoid, that person could very well die, or you could get the exchange and then take their place and then eventually give him the win. So he's very good at that. In chases, as we've said, he's also pretty lethal as long as he can throw knives at you. And any loop where he can throw knives at you, you will need to abandon or take a hit very early, or a health state rather. But here's the problem. He's not particularly fast. Moves at 110. He needs to reload from his knife from lockers to refill his knives every now and then, which doesn't help with his mobility overall. He has a terror range of 24 meters, yes, but also has a lullaby that is bigger than that. So you can actually hear him coming from further if you pay attention, and that lullaby, even though it's subtle, it can never go away. So he's not a particularly stealthy character. And on top of that, he doesn't deal with the structures that are tall very well. So if you're playing in the shack and you go around the long side and he doesn't have a very big lead on you, he's not super close to you already, he cannot do anything. He cannot do anything. He needs to leave you. You're in one of those jungle gyms that's connected to something else, and for some reason you can see him over over the wall or something. You have object of obsession, or it's one of those loops where it's tall enough for you to not get hit, but short enough for you to see over it. He is in trouble. He is in deep, deep trouble. These loops are really troublesome for him. And sometimes you see survivors from afar and you get one knife on them and then they're already behind something and you know that that's going to be a really hard chase. And unfortunately, some maps are full of stuff like this. If you go into Badham, any of the buildings, you chase a survivor and they take 2 steps, they're already behind a wall. They take another 2 steps, they're already behind 3 layers of walls. They take another 2 steps, now you cannot do anything. It's really, really infuriating just how little he can do in this situation. So in maps like this, he becomes more of a hook in a good spot, camp, and be a good defensive killer rather than, oh, just go around the whole map chasing people because you're slow and you generally cannot afford to do that. But when you consider all of that, when you consider the fact that you can push survivors into certain areas, that most maps are not terrible for you, that survivors making mistakes go down in mere seconds, that his add-ons are pretty good, that even though he doesn't, much like Huntress, he doesn't have a lot of build variety, but he does have a few perks that work okay. Then he's okay, he's alright, he's fun. And most of all, he's a killer that gets better the more you play him, and the more you understand how to use his knives and how you can hit over obstacles that don't even look like you can hit, and how you can basically shred through survivors when they're doing certain actions. So if you consider all of that, I would say he's worthy of B tier. Next up is Doctor, and many people, I think out of all the killers so far, many people overestimate how strong Doctor is. He has a kit filled with useful things that are very intimidating and powerful against new players. He has the ability to make people scream, which basically negates stealth. He shocks people, and then this shock denies them the ability to drop pallets, which means that they or vault windows or do any action whatsoever. Which means that in chase, you can lose the one thing you can do against the killer to gain distance on them, right? And all of this is very oppressive until you realize that it doesn't always matter so much. Unfortunately, Doctor doesn't have the ability to down survivors from afar. So the fact that you know where multiple survivors is, especially if they split up just a little bit and they're in safe areas, doesn't mean a lot if you cannot physically down them and exert that pressure on them. Survivors that are smart against Doctor will split up. That means that his static blast will never afflict madness to many people at once. That means they won't have to snap out of madness and deal with the side effects too much. And when it comes to chase, his power ultimately doesn't achieve as many things as some of the other killers do. Some of the other killers can get a hit and destroy a pallet very quickly, whereas Doctor can shock you and sometimes prevent the pallet drop, but then they'll hit you and then that pallet will be there for later, which can be a bit troublesome. There's also the fact that survivors can dead hard, don't forget, very common perk, can dead hard through your shock to completely avoid it and still drop the pallet if it's safe enough. This will extend their chase a lot. And unfortunately, there's a component of ping and latency where you can shock a survivor, and because in their screen they already had press space, even though you shocked them before they made it to the pallet, they drop the pallet anyway, or vault the window anyway, which can be extremely frustrating. When you consider all of these things, Doctor, despite having a nice kit and being somewhat good at everything, is okay-ish. Now let's talk about some of his strengths and some of the reasons why he actually can thrive despite all of this. His skill ceiling is actually fairly high. Knowing when to use your blast, is nice, but using it at the right times to strategically inflict minus tier 3 on survivors is a very underrated skill to have. If you manage to keep survivors in tier 2, and then when they need to heal others, you put them in tier 3, you can deny them of using items. They cannot use flashlights to save. They cannot use medkits against you. All of these things can be quite interesting. And then it also It also shows up in different ways. Your skill can show up in different ways when you use your shock therapy. You can use little tricks to make somewhat unsafe pallets into completely unsafe pallets that are dealt with in seconds, which is great. He saves a bit of time in that. He also saves times overall. If you always find one survivor early with your blast, even without any perks, that will probably put you ahead of many other killers that need to look for them very carefully. A few little tricks can help to shut down loops that would otherwise give you trouble. And luckily, he's got a range of add-ons that can help in all rarities, and I would even say in all skill brackets. If you're a newer player and you go against newer players, Doctor has amazing add-ons. And if you're going to go against the more serious players, you also have some options. So for the newer players, you might want to bring add-ons that create illusory palettes or that show you the aura of survivors, things to help you and to confuse them a little bit. Against the stronger survivors, you can just stick to the very tried and true add-ons that help you in chase. Despite the ping issue that I mentioned earlier, Doctor has a family of add-ons called Discipline that allows you to shock a survivor and they get shocked. They get the effect of the shock 0.3, 0.2, and 0.1 seconds earlier. So if you go for one of the stronger ones and add some range or something like that, suddenly your power is a lot more manageable. And survivors, they can still dead hard through it, but they'll need to play a lot better and you have a lot more reliability on your shocks to actually down them in chase. And once you down one of them in chase, then you start to generate pressure on the others. So if we take into account the fact that his add-ons are pretty dependable at almost any turn, he's pretty okay. Problem. Some maps are just too safe. They are just too safe. You can know where a survivor is, and even if you have a bit of a head start, they'll still have very safe pallets, and you really don't have a lot of help. You need to rely on your perks a lot to get your downs quicker with lethality or something like that, or to keep the gens away. Consider, however, the fact that Doctor now pairs really well with a very popular perk in the meta right now, which is Pain Res and or even by itself, Deadman Switch. Deadman Switch is a perk where if you blast a set of survivors away from a gen, which you can as a Doctor, other killers cannot do that from afar, they'll let go of the generator and then the generator will be blocked. And this can buy you quite a bit of time. Especially if it gets blocked and they have to snap out of -3 and then you chase them and so on. So he does feed quite well with some of the current perks that have been released over the last few DLCs. So that's maybe what ultimately gives him an advantage over some of the other M1 killers that we're going to see in a little bit that also have trouble in chase. Next up is Legion. Now, many people consider Legion to be one of the worst killers in the game. Their skill ceiling is probably the first out of the whole set of killers to be relatively low. Their add-ons are okay. They're decent. We'll talk about it in a minute. But once you've injured someone with your power, then you actually have to chase them. You are at the absolute mercy of the map. Strong windows, strong pallets, anything, perks on the survivor side, anything to delay that down. And Legion, at least in principle, has nothing to help you actually down people. He doesn't have any real chasing power. The ability to body block, Infernal Frenzy, all of these things, they are extremely unlikely to help you in chase. So when you consider all of that, Legion would come across as one of the worst killers in the game. But there's actually a few other things that are very worth mentioning that I think might change your mind and definitely explain why I place him so high, because many other people would argue that he is weaker or one of the weakest killers. So what's the deal with Legion? Number one, Legion can, by very virtue of getting close to you, injure you. Not only injure you, but put you into deep wound. Yes, healing now is very quick. Not as quick as before. The boons got nerfed a tiny bit, the healing boon, circle of healing, but it's still very fast, especially with medkits. So the fact that you can injure them, to some people, it's not such a big deal anymore if they can kind of heal fast. But let me tell you why this is not as big of a deal as it seems. If survivors have a styptic or a syringe, they cannot use it right away in chase because they're deep wounded. If they were going to get adrenaline, they will not be fully healed because they are deep wounded. Being deep wounded means that you cannot fully open an exit gate without going down. There are many things that are very inconvenient when you are deep wounded. And being able to very quickly put people into deep wound is a big deal. Now, very good survivors, they are very comfortable being injured, and in fact, they play just as well as when they're injured. They might have Iron Will, they might have Dead Heart, they're very ready for it. But immediately, any survivor that is clumsy and falls for mind games at normal tiles will go down as a Legion much quicker than many other killers. And don't forget that once you hook this one survivor who maybe went down because you did a cool mind game on them, don't forget you're a bit shorter, so you can get away with those a bit more often, now has a bunch of teammates that cannot come for the rescue because they're injured and you hit them as well. And if they do come, they have to heal first. And if they do heal first, well, you are very good at injuring them once again. So it's a back and forth where they are not exclusively doing gens, which is awesome for you. Legion also has an amazing time using gen regression perks and uses them really, really well. The fact that you can track survivors with Killer Instinct once you get into your power means that that one survivor that wasn't so good, you can find them again and get them killed out of the game as soon as possible. With other killers, you don't have the luxury of finding people randomly around the map, which is great. The fact that you have info from your power also means that you can be a little bit less inclined to run info perks. You don't need Barbecue, Tinker, Discordant. You can run one or none info perks and focus almost exclusively on gen regression, which Legion uses very, very well. Almost every perk has great synergy with them, and even spice up your build and add in maybe one chasing perk. You put in a cheeky little play with your food, a cheeky little ammo ears, and even the really good survivors will go down to your Legion. People do not expect the Legion moving 5% faster. People do not expect the Legion waiting behind a random wall because they can see your aura. And once they go down, you have a massive advantage over many other killers that have to work so much harder. Don't forget that with other killers, survivors drop a pallet early on and they're safe and you break the pallet. With Legion, if they drop a pallet, you vault over it and you still hit them. And then you can later break it if you want to, if it's a safe or unsafe enough pallet for you to consider doing that. And with the best add-on on Legion, his iridescent pin, you can break the pallet immediately as it's broken and still get the hit, and then get a map-wide terror radius to literally find anyone else. If you play Legion clumsily, you will try to be a bit stupid and be like, oh, I'm gonna chase this person, oh, I ran out of my power. If you're smart, you're going to find people from afar, cancel your power, get close, get them all injured. And honestly, even if they do have very decent medkits and very decent wounds, they will also need to be very good in chase for them to consistently keep up with how quickly you can injure them. Your worst enemy is Legion. Very large maps with extremely smart survivors that just split up really, really, really aggressively and never really allow you to injure them very quickly. And then once you find each of them, they all play like absolute professionals. They play super, super good, and they play super, super safe once they're injured. They never drop a pallet while they're healthy. They only really use their resources when it matters. And then those games are really hard. Admittedly, those games are difficult. Luckily for you, most maps are not like that. Most survivors are not like that. And the fact that you keep everybody injured, or most people injured right off the bat, is a pressure that I think the average team doesn't perform very well under. So luckily in your normal public matches, you can use this to your advantage. There's a couple other add-ons that are worth mentioning that can tie okay in certain builds. For example, you can use the other iridescent to have information on gens, so that you don't really want to worry at all about bringing information related perks to when it comes to gen. So his builds are actually quite mean. He fits quite nicely into the meta, if you ask me. So that's why I place him relatively high. But ultimately, don't forget the fact that once you're injured, if you're comfortable being injured and your teammates are reliable, they can let you hang in the hook for a long time, have one person come in last second, and then Legion doesn't have a lot of unhook potential. So his late game can be a bit sad, and his early game and his mid game can be a bit difficult if survivors are just really smart about when and how they heal. But yeah, that's pretty much it about Legion. Next up is Wraith. Now, Wraith got buffed some months ago to the point where some people I think the developers might have hinted that he was one of the most deadly killers back then. Luckily, I mean, not luckily, but unfortunately, this was short-lived. People began to understand how to play against him. He also got hit by a couple of nerfs, and now he's in this very mediocre position. His skill ceiling is not really high when it comes to mechanical skill and aiming and anything like that, but the decision making is very important, and the odd here and there situations where you need to body block survivors, you need to be quick-witted and you need to act and react quickly on your feet. So if you do all of that, and you're ready to do all of that, your skill will translate into much better games as Wraith. His add-ons, while not absolutely game-breaking, are pretty decent. A couple browns that will blow your mind for how good they are. A few yellows that are really good. Greens get better, purples get better, and his iridescents are serviceable. They're pretty good for what they do. So his add-ons actually are one of the things that elevate him a little bit over some of the other killers that we're going to say in a minute. And they definitely help a lot. And you want to run them as much as possible because they help, and they are just straight up improvements that do make a difference in chase. So Wraith has great mobility, almost more so than any other killer. He's going to get into his first chase very quickly. We'll see how long that chase takes, but whatever. It could be an immediate hit, or it could be a 3-minute chase, depending on how it goes. But no matter what happens when that chase is over, your next chase will also begin very quickly. His mobility and the fact that he creeps up to survivors means that he wastes very little time between chases. So even if his chases are a bit longer than some other killers, he might actually be faster overall with everything, considering that he wastes very little time in between them. So that's great. He doesn't have any terrible maps. The huge maps he can traverse more or less okay. The small, cramped indoor maps are ideal for many of his builds and approach, so that's great. It's just mostly maps that are very dense with pallets. Unlike some of the other killers here, he doesn't get any help whatsoever when it comes to chases. He doesn't have, other than the odd ability to body block a survivor here and there before they make it to a pallet or window, or when they're working a gen, you do not get anything for free. You need to rely on your ability to ambush survivors, and once they're in the mindset of like, okay, the killer's here, where are my points of safety, it all comes down to your ability to either brute force a chase or do some kind of mind game and make them as short as possible, and understand that sometimes you need to drop the chase and go for someone else and try to ambush them instead. So ultimately, Wraith is a big has a big discrepancy in teams that are aware and communicated and even cooperate to take hits for each other, and teams that are alone, disorganized, and not really working together. Against the latter, then he's definitely a much stronger killer. You will catch people off guard constantly. They will send people for the rescue predictably. One of them will take a slap, the other person will be too late. You will also hit them, and the other person will finish healing, but too late. It's out of the second stage. And you will win games just based on the chaos alone that your ability to move around the map and hit people out of stealth creates. Against a very organized team, someone will spot you, they'll be happy to drop a pallet, not to take even the first hit, and your first chase will be difficult. You will opt to go for someone else, but this person will know that you're coming because they were warned, or they had spine chill or something like that. And now you're in a difficult situation where you're losing gens, you don't have a down, and without a down, nothing else really matters. So in that regard, Wraith is unfortunately a little bit mediocre, but you do not want to judge him only on his worst case scenario. On average, you're going to be playing against a mixture of survivor fans and solo players. And on average, not every map is an absolute, plays itself horrible pallet fest. So on average, Wraith can do okay, and his add-ons make up for many of his shortcomings. The little bits of plays that you can do here and there to body block can also shorten your chases a lot. The fact that survivors cannot just hold forward against you. In many maps, you hit a survivor and they run forever. With Wraith, you can just cloak and catch up to them very quickly with some add-ons. So some of these things are underrated things that that the Wraith something doesn't get enough credit for. Just look out for killers, for survivors that are smart and loop you very well, and look out for the odd flashlight here and there that can burn you. And then for the most part, he's a solid, decent killer. Next up, we have Sadako. And Sadako, much like Wraith, has a big discrepancy in her performance when it comes to playing against survivors that are very, very well organized, and playing against survivors that are all by themselves and not really playing as a team. Against people that do not play as a team, Sadako is probably a lot more deadly, since they cannot really communicate. Anytime you catch a survivor off guard, it's going to be almost a free hit because she's a stealthy killer, and they will have no idea that you're coming, potentially. And anytime that you change targets, they will also have to keep constantly guessing. They will not know for sure. So your chances to catch the next survivor off guard are much higher. So as I said, she doesn't have the mobility of Wraith, but she does have a similar stealth. You can hear her very faintly when she's nearby, which is a bit upsetting. But in a normal game, when you're doing generators, you don't hear her so well. So she has a decent chance to approach almost undetected towards survivors. Unfortunately, her add-ons are not at all like Wraiths. They do not scale up super well. Some of her higher rarity add-ons are fairly useless. Some of her mid-range add-ons are just straight up bad. And ultimately, she has a few add-ons that are okay, and some add-ons that do things that are just not reliable enough for you to want to bring them. So her add-ons are very mild, with a brown being one of her best add-ons, and maybe the iridescent tape that allows her to reset TBs being slightly better. Ultimately, this is pretty much what she has going for her. Her ability to condemn survivors seldom comes into play. When you teleport to a TB, that builds a condemn, but you cannot do this repeatedly and still get hooks and progress towards your objective unless you're in some insanely cramped map and survivors who really don't know what they're doing. So the whole condemn is so little, it's such a small thread that survivors will just work on a gen, they'll hear a TV nearby, they'll keep an eye, and if they hear something, they'll walk away. They will almost never mess with TBs themselves, and they will almost never be carrying tapes unless you use the add-on to make them start with a tape. So her secondary power is extremely underwhelming, and it really comes down to her ability to catch people off guard, and then use the fact that she's small, short, relatively quiet to maybe mind game in some loops and get a hit here and there. One thing that's remarkable though is that she does have an invisibility when she's the manifested, and this invisibility remains for a few seconds and flickers on and off for a few seconds when she becomes manifested. This is a predictable, it's not a random thing, it's a predictable time. And with a certain add-on, this window of invisibility becomes larger. So large that in many loops, you actually can reliably disappear for like half a second and time it in such a way that the survivor has to guess. And in that guessing, I guarantee you'll have a really good chance of hitting them. Unless they've seen it a few times before and they just preemptively run away or get a little bit lucky, I think you have a really good chance if they find themselves in one of these short loops with a pallet and you use this brown add-on. So she does have a bit of potential in that you can understand how this works or just try your luck, and just your flickering can throw survivors off. So she does get that little bit of help in chase, but ultimately, if survivors have spine chill and you don't know how to fool it, if survivors are just really well aware or really well coordinated, your ability to ambush is going to diminish. And once you're already in a chase, what exactly are you going to do? You have TBs that don't help a lot. Survivors don't have to bother with TBs very much to remove condemn until they're almost there. And once they do, they can take the TB and put it in front of your face. There are some chances for you to try to interrupt them, but ultimately it is very difficult to do that and keep up with the actual game. So ultimately, the whole condemn is a very secondary thing for her. And it's just tough. It's just tough if you're in one of those maps that are open, where survivors can work on gens and see very well around them, where the TBs maybe are not the most conveniently placed, and you don't really have a big chance to catch them off guard much. And once you do, they just have a lot of pallets that are super safe. I've seen this girl struggle in maps like this. So you will need to focus on your macro gameplay rather than your micro. You will need to focus more on how you're catching multiple survivors off guard and how to harass many of them on and off until something gives in, rather than just to focus in chase. She's not a strong chase killer, unfortunately, as it stands, and thus this placement on the tier list. That being said, it's worth mentioning that even though her skill ceiling is not super high, with a few caveats, and her add-ons are not super helpful, there are a few maps where the Onryo is particularly nasty. When you cannot see around yourself very well because it's indoors and the TVs are really cramped up, then many survivors will feel threatened. They will not be as efficient, and your angles to strike from are much more threatening to the survivors. So she does have the occasional map where she can easily outperform even higher tier killers, just by virtue of her power of being the manifested and being able to traverse the map, which also comes up a lot, by the way, when it comes to Noid. I found that Noid, or any perks that insta down and give you a bit of a threat, these perks can often be outplayed by survivors simply spreading out. This is not always the case with Sadako. Sometimes with Sadako, she can be very threatening and down multiple people across different exit gates and across the map. So you can never be too complacent against her. And these are some unique strengths that other killers that have high mobility even don't always have. So worth mentioning, I suppose. Next up is Clown, and Clown, in my opinion, is a bit of a stretch on this C tier, and this is assuming that you really play him well. Clown has a tremendously high skill ceiling. His skill floor is easy enough to achieve. You can play Clown decently well with very little training and very few hours, but really understanding how his powers work and using them well, I think takes a lot of time, and many people that are dedicated to playing Clown can tell you that. He's a fairly straightforward killer. Normal movement speed, mobile terror radius, doesn't have any fantastic powers to teleport or anything like that. He doesn't have any built-in insta down. Instead, he has two bottles that he can switch to and from. One of them is purple and slows down the survivors and doesn't affect him, and the other one is yellow and it slows, it speeds him up, but also the survivors. So he's the only killer, I think, in the cast that can actually buff survivors accidentally if you misplay that, but it doesn't happen very often. It's not a huge deal or a game or a deal breaker or anything like that. So these bottles, let's talk about them. They have both bottles have some utility things to them. That you can use regardless of their actual effect. If you throw a bottle and you directly hit a survivor, you can interrupt them. So a survivor doing a totem in front of you and about to mend it, or a survivor going for a rescue in front of you and about to finish the rescue, you could totally interrupt these actions and bring them back to zero or delay them a bit if it's a generator, for example, with a bottle from a distance, which is nice. The purple bottles themselves slow down survivors enough so that most loops can be shortened very dramatically, especially with some add-ons. And then the yellow bottle is more of a plus that you can throw at certain areas to speed yourself up. And in conjunction with this purple bottle, it makes most loops completely one-sided. So what does all of this mean for Clown? The Clown is basically very lacking in mobility, in map presence overall. For these, you need to hope that it's a small map and pray that you get something other than Mother's Dwelling, some of the bigger maps. And also, he doesn't have any particular ability to slow down generators or anything like that passively. Or even gather information on them like Scan or anything like that. So you really are relying on your perks to hold the gens together while you do what you do best. And what the Clown does best is chase. Unlike many other killers like Wraith, there is not necessarily a lot of mind gaming or hoping that they are bad. You literally can brute force your way out of loops very quickly. If a survivor allows you to, you can get ahead in many loops if they misplay it. Most of the time, if the pallet in the loop is safe enough, what will happen is that they'll be forced to drop the pallet immediately, which is not a horrible thing. Consider that with other killers, you might do 2 loops around them before they drop it, or get hit. And if survivors underestimate you, and especially if they underestimate your ability to combine yellow and purple bottles, it will be a hit more often than not. If you're a bit lucky, maybe your perks help you to instant down so that one hit is a big deal, or the survivors are even more scared and they drop pallets even quicker. So unlike some other killers where you have to do a bit of guessing and a little bit of mind game and a little bit of hoping and praying to baby Jesus that survivors make a mistake, with Clown you can get fairly predictable results at certain loops. A pallet gets dropped that is normally safe. You throw a bottle on it. You put you give yourself a yellow one. Survivors will be slowed down, but also will see and hear worse. So they're more prone to making a mistake. Maybe you have the add-on to see through walls. We haven't really talked about these add-ons, but overall they are decent. And you will get hits in places that other killers could not dream of without breaking a pallet. So overall, his chase power is quite good. And he does have some second-hand unintended strengths when it comes to unhook scenarios. Because you slow down survivors so much, after an unhook, it's very difficult for the rescuer to body block the person being rescued. So you can be quite good at tunneling. And if they try to use borrowed time against you, you can slow them down and wait out the 12 seconds. If they go through a window, they're never going to vault it fast, so it will be a medium vault because they're slowed down, so you can grab them. And if at that point you know that they don't have decisive, that's another hook that happens right away. So he's quite good at the unhook scenarios, a bit more than some other killers, and to secure a hit out of them. And he can also basically deny other survivors body blocking a little bit, especially if he uses bottles in conjunction. So when you consider all of that, when you consider that almost any loop, almost any shack, any structure is basically like a mathematical equation that he can solve to immediately get a result out of it, either the pallet or the hit, Clown can brute force his way into having early hooks that other killers would struggle with. And that alone, with the help of some perks, I think is really, really powerful. Let's talk about some of his weaknesses, however. His add-ons are quite okay, with some of the higher rarity ones being decent, and overall giving him a nice boost in most areas, with some of them being kind of silly, but overall decent add-ons. The problem is mostly maps. In very large maps where pallets are extremely abundant and extremely safe, yeah, you will create dead zones eventually, but it is very difficult to get stuff done and get a few hooks before survivors really get going. It's difficult. Those would be your worst nightmares as a clown. You will occasionally also just eat unfair and untimely perks coming your way. Dead Heart can still save survivors a little bit, even though not as much. You will still occasionally eat a Styptic or some other clutch perk or item coming in clutch for the survivors, and you're not particularly resilient to those. When you consider all of that, if you play Clown absolutely surgically perfect, and you play him really well, I think he has the potential to be around here, but ultimately doesn't get much higher. He's one of his stronger add-ons that allowed him to instant down has now been nerfed, and you need another add-on to make it play like before. It's still strong. Some of the other add-ons are okay. They enhance him in a couple different ways. The builds that you can have on Clown are actually fairly fun and interesting, and some of the add-ons that you have available to you are very unexpected for the survivors. If you have, for example, the cigar box that allows you to see autos of survivors, they really don't see it coming, and you can create openings and force survivors into making mistakes that they would typically not make against a more straightforward killer. So in that regard, he's okay. He's all right. Clown's fun. Give him a shot. Next up is Ghostface. You'll notice a trend that many of the stealth killers are down here, and again, Ghostface does struggle significantly more against survivors that are aware. Spine Chill, unfortunately, is not as easy to fool. With something like Wraith or even Sadako, the Onryo, you could look sideways to approach a survivor and then not full Spine Chill, not trigger Spine Chill. But with Ghostface, at some point, you're going to have to stalk them and look at them. And when you do that, Spine Chill will inevitably light up. If it's not Spine Chill, it might just be a big map with open fields, or it might just be a teammate calling you out or revealing you from someone else. So yeah, Ghostface, by virtue of being a stealth killer, definitely performs better against unprepared, disorganized survivors rather than the really aware or really communicated, coordinated survivors. So that's something worth reminding everyone about. His add-ons, unfortunately, are not incredible. Without add-ons, his recovery is not as bad as it was before because they changed it, which is awesome. But his recovery add-ons were nerfed in turn. So recovery add-ons are basically your bread and butter to get into your power back faster, with the odd other add-on here and there that does a little something. Compared to some of the other killers that have add-ons that insta-down, add-ons that show survivors aura from this and that, like, these add-ons are extremely mild. And whereas with other killers, I can constantly worry about which add-ons they are using, with Ghostface, it almost doesn't matter. From the survivor point of view, playing against the Ghostface is ultimately almost always the same. So his add-ons, unfortunately, don't elevate him a lot. But he does have the solid ability to instant down survivors. And the solid ability to approach them with a 0 terror radius without any penalty to movement speed or anything like that. That alone is pretty good. If at the start of the game you have lethal pursuer and you scout out the survivors, or you're just lucky enough to run into them and approach them and they don't notice you, that is potentially a grab or an instant down, or even better, sometimes you will 99 their stalking and leave them like that, then go for someone else. And when that other person that you left 99 later comes later, that you 99 earlier, when they later come to do a rescue or to take a hit, they will realize that they can be instant down immediately, a little bit too late. And that ability to basically 99 people and leave them as potential instant downs later makes Ghostface really scary and gives him an ability to snowball and turn things around, sometimes at times where survivors feel very, very confident. It's also, unfortunately, the opposite is also unfortunately true. You could have a really good play going where you mark a survivor and then they suddenly just make it, they have swimmers or whatever, and they make it to a pallet you didn't think they could, and now you cannot chase them, and the marking goes away. You could also stalk somewhere and accidentally mark someone that you didn't mean to. You could also get revealed from very obnoxiously large distances. So a lot of things can go wrong with Ghostface, and this placement assumes that you're going to be avoiding most of them by playing really, really smart. You're going to be crouching behind obstacles so that the reveal is interrupted. You're going to be leaning as much as possible and 99ing people and catching people off guard and using all kinds of perks to have information of where they are, catch them off guard. And once they begin to play a bit more cautiously, you're just going to brute force it a little bit. That's typically how it goes. Ghostface's ability does allow him to perform okay in maps where other killers would really, really struggle. The fact that he can just remove his terror radius makes maps like Batham, for example, not entirely safe for survivors, because if they don't see you, if they don't see around them very well because of fences, walls, buildings, you do have a chance to be scary and catch them off guard. So he can occasionally have good games in maps where you would have no business doing well with most killers, so that's great. But he also just suffers from the fact that he doesn't have any crazy mobility, that open maps are a thing, and the very safe pallets sometimes are a big deal if survivors are aware, and none of them are easily getting ambushed time after time after time. Even average survivors will eventually realize, okay, it's a Ghostface, let's be a bit smart. You do have an answer to all of this. Some very good Ghostfaces get really good at finding tricky angles that have like the ability to stalk survivors on generators from really far places or through really intricate holes in buildings and structures. So that's nice. Some people will use play with your food or discordance or all kinds of info perks to constantly switch targets and have a speed boost to go with it and so on. So you do have some answers to this. And I think on average, as a Ghostface, you're going to do quite okay if you're quite skilled with him. But ultimately, you have a killer that doesn't have any real chasing power. He's crouching. It's not something you can do consistently in every loop. Removing your terror radius means very little when survivors communicate where you are. So it really comes down to using all of your tools very effectively. If you have a team that doesn't do super well, you're probably going to eat them up. If you have a team that puts up a lot of resistance and they are very aware, you're going to have to 99 all of them, give them a false sense of security, constantly drag them into places where you know they have a hard time unhooking and so on, and use the very best perks and add-ons blood points come by. So yeah, that's Ghostface in a nutshell. Next up, we have the Nightmare. Now, the Nightmare is one of the few killers that I will just straight up say has a relatively a relatively low skill ceiling and very bad add-ons. This killer has gone through many iterations and nerfs and buffs. In the state he is right now, he's apparently still one of the more reliable, strong killers on average. But many things about him are just weird, and his add-ons are definitely terrible. His map dependency, however, is not too bad. The fact that he can teleport towards gens that are not completed yet means that even if you hook really far, you can still cover distances quite fast. And this is maybe his strongest asset, the fact that he can teleport to gens and use gen regression perks and builds that include strong gen regression perks like Pop and so on. This is maybe his best weapon that sets him apart from other killers the most, and that's awesome. But apart from that, he's got very little going for him. He typically has 2 powers. With add-ons, you can make him have illusory pallets, which will replace broken or inexistent pallets in the map. And this can fool survivors if they are asleep. Don't forget, survivors fall asleep passively. And then he's got the snares. Also only work if they're asleep and they get slowed down. Straight up, I'll tell you, the snares are better. The pallets are extremely map dependent. In some maps, you literally have like 3 spots where you can place pallets, and every other spot already has a pallet. So that means that the only pallets that you can fake are pallets that you've already broken. So if you go to the shack and you break the shack pallet, and then you break the pallet next to it, yes, you can put those pallets there, but then that guy will know that they're fake because he's dropped them, and then his friends are gonna be like, "Hey, did you drop shack pallet?" Yes. Okay, so this pallet is fake. So there's a myriad of ways to tell if a pallet is fake from experience, and it will only really fool beginner survivors and survivors that are really, really lost in the first place. So overall, pallets have a massive tendency to underperform against the really good, smart, aware, well-coordinated, communicated survivors. So don't run pallets. It goes without saying that you also need to use an add-on to have them. So they are, I think, the worst options. Snares are a little bit better. In most loops, they shorten the chase time by quite a bit. But again, the survivor needs to be asleep, and survivors sometimes will just run to the next loop. But assuming that they are forced into a single loop, you can put snares ahead of time. You can put them in chase pretty smoothly, and it will shorten your chases quite a bit. Unfortunately, survivors can't stay awake by using the clocks, which now they were buffed somewhat recently, and now survivors that wake up with a clock will not fall asleep for 30 seconds. Even if you hit them, they will not fall asleep for those 30 seconds, and then 60 seconds before they fall asleep naturally. So survivors will be awake a lot more. Your teleporting is nice, but it doesn't do a lot unless you're getting downs. And here's the thing. As I said, survivors don't fall asleep too much. The pallets are really not so good. If they are smart, they will not go down easily. And then you have a killer with a somewhat okay chasing power that has a hard time getting downs early on because it doesn't work early on. So your early game as Freddy is really difficult. Freddy, more so than other killers, needs perks to complement the gaps in his power. He needs Corrupt Intervention, he needs Ruin, he needs Deadlock, he needs Discordance, he needs perks to constantly block and harass people off gens for the first minute until people finally begin to fall asleep and his power is more relevant. If you're going against decent average or below average survivors, maybe you don't need that. With a couple mind games, he's a bit short, he's not particularly loud. Survivors are oblivious, so they don't always see exactly. They hear the lullaby, but they don't know exactly where you're coming. You will occasionally get free hits here and there, which is awesome. But for the most part, if they're smart, they're not going to go down easy. And it's really difficult to use your perks well if they don't. So for that reason, he has a hard time using his power alone to win games. you need perks to slow down the gens, and once you teleport, make that teleport count. If you teleport to a gent that's 99% and then you just kick it, it's not very good. You're going to want to pop it, you're going to want to have Ruin, you're going to want to block it with No Man Switch, Dead Man Switch, and Deadlock, and so on. And then he becomes an okay killer that is only as strong as survivors and the map allows you, basically, with a very strong palette field maps being significantly harder for him. But I bet you already knew that. So overall, he's okay. If your survivors are a little bit worse at chasing than average, even if they have very good items, this killer can go up a little bit. If I was playing against survivors that I knew were not very good at looping, I might want to play Freddy instead of Wraith, because I know that if they're not very good at looping, even if it takes me a little bit to get to them, I'm gonna down them, teleport, and keep the gen under control. So there's definitely situations and matches where Freddy's powers are more than adequate and he's more than okay, and you get your ass kicked by him if you're playing Survivor. Or you don't, but your teammates do, and then your gem gets exploded. So he's okay, and he's quite okay, but it doesn't get much better than that. Moving on, we reach the pick. The pick has an unfortunate power when it comes to RNG. She can set down traps on survivors that are down, and these can take anywhere from 20 seconds to 2 minutes to remove. This feels a bit bad, but obviously we're doing a tier list of averages. So on average, we're going to assume that these are okay-ish, and they, on average, delay the game a fair amount, and they're not too bad. They are, in a way, the pick's best asset. And the fact that you can stack these with other slowdown and other concerns and other threats makes the pick a little bit scary. Her add-ons are okay-ish. Some of her rare ones being quite threatening and potentially damaging to survivors that are not super coordinated. If everybody starts with a trap on, which is one of her areas, that can be quite confusing. And there's a lot of pig builds with map offerings that are actually pretty strong. If you send yourself to a certain map with a certain build, with certain perks, and the survivors are not super bright, that's very hard to lose and very difficult to win for the survivors. But assuming that you don't have that advantage, that you're going to go to random, even sometimes unfavorable maps, then all of these strategies are not quite as good. And her add-ons are okay, but none of them are straight up improvements that guarantee great results. Almost all of them have some silver lining or something to them that makes them a little bit risky or potentially less powerful than you think. But her add-ons are okay. Her map dependency, I would say, is fairly large. As a semi-stealth killer, very open maps with very strong palettes such as Cowshed are difficult, whereas indoor maps can sometimes be tricky because you can use stealth, and the boxes are sometimes harder to find or harder to access. So she does have a few maps where she shines a little bit, and many maps that are just not great for her. Luckily, again, perks can make up for that to cover for you weaknesses in larger maps and so on. And then, now that we cover her slowdown and her little stealth abilities, which can sometimes be okay, but are not super reliable, it comes down to her chasing power. Her chasing power is sad. Her chasing power is really, really sad. If you want your slowdown to be more reliable or more of a threat, you bring slowdown, reverse bear trap add-ons, but then your chasing power will be very mediocre. And if you want to improve your chasing power a little bit, then you can decide to forget about these add-ons and bring one of her few add-ons to increase her chase potential. And these make her chase power a little bit better. She can crouch and then do an attack out of it. Much like Doctor, there are many loops that are somewhat unsafe, and then Pick makes them straight up immediately unsafe. So she does make a few, these are not very common, but she does make a few loops basically guaranteed hits. And if you allow the pig to stay at the pallet in a small loop, and you try to play around it, her speed and the fact that she can change sides very quickly, even do a bit of a moon dash and go backwards and some other fancy things, or even go over some obstacles and fly over them, she is most certainly going to hit you there. Problems. Survivors can use Dead Heart at the end of a dash, and if they time it well at the end of a dash, they should be safe. Survivors can just run away when you crouch, and if you don't have certain add-ons, you don't see it, or when you crouch up, you're kind of slow, so they gain distance. So this is something that you can try to bait, but ultimately you're wasting time. And this is also a situation that can just be avoided in the first place if the survivors simply drop the pallet. If a pallet is somewhat safe, you can play around it, sure. If it's one of these pallets in a small tile, you get to the pallet, you just simply drop it. And once you drop it, the pig doesn't have a power that goes through the pallet or around the pallet significantly enough. So if you want to see a pig player get frustrated, just drop every pallet. Don't let them be at the pallet where they use their power, just drop every pallet. And the answer is typically to break it or keep chasing you around it and bloodlust you. And it's nothing super big. So unlike a killer like Cannibal or Huntress or Trickster, if you're right in front of a pig, her chasing power is more of a second thought. She's not going to be using ambushes all the time. They don't work with insta-down perks or anything. So most of the time, a pig is going to be a normal M1 killer with a bit of stealth, with a bit of slowdown, potentially a lot if she's lucky, and with a bit of chasing power on the side that in many maps it falls flat, that doesn't really perform super well, that gets countered by most common perks. Healing against her is good, dead hard against her is good, doing everything is quite good, assuming that the pig doesn't have a very evil build with a certain map in mind, and that she is at the mercy of the map pool. I think pig struggles a little bit. That being said, nothing stopping you from running very strong regression perks, adding them onto your slowdown power, or adding hexes or something else that really needs attention, and then trying to overwhelm the survivors. If you do that, then the pig actually is quite powerful. A survivor doing a box is not going to bother finding bones, and if you don't find bones, maybe the Devour Hope will kill the rest of your team. There's a lot of little ways you can make pig quite strong and quite dependable, but ultimately you're going to need a lot of pallets, and you're going to need to be very, very good at using your power in the few places where it's actually quite decent. And that's about it for pig. Next up is Trapper. Now, Trapper is a bit of a sad case because over the last few years, he's received a lot of small but then significant add-ons that have all made him quite a bit better. He now, I will say right now, he now can use 2 traps and carry 2 traps by default, and the amount of traps that spawn in the map are fixed, not random anymore, which is great. You also now escape traps. It has a fixed amount of maximum escapes, so the RNG has been toned down a little bit. On top of that, he now has some much better add-ons than before, and he's less dependent on them. And he can reset traps on the ground, which he couldn't do some years ago. Some of these things are really nice. But then we have 2 problems, I would say. One of them is more recent. The other one is the same old problem. The same old problem is the fact that the Trapper, for the most part, has to spend time setting up. When you start the game, you carry 2 traps or whatever, you see a trap at your feet, you maybe not be able to pick it up. So you need to set up a trap somewhere, then pick it up. You need to do a lot of quests, fetching quests to pick up your own power, which may or may not work. A survivor stepping on a trap, if you're close, is an immediate down. If you're far, it can mean absolutely nothing, other than the trap is now disarmed and they were inconvenienced for 3 seconds. So the traps are only powerful when they're near you. They can potentially be very meaningless, and it takes a long time to set them up and pick them up. Not to mention that some of them still spawn in faraway corners, in hills or structures that you don't have time to navigate towards in a normal game without wasting massive time. So he starts at a big deficit that doesn't always pay off. So that's always been a problem with Trapper, and this hasn't changed much. One very notable exception, however, is a purple add-on called the Trapper Sack. This add-on makes him start with all of his traps. He cannot collect them and reset them in different places. He can only rearm them on the ground. I think this is his best add-on. This eliminates the problem of Trapper having to pick up stuff on the ground. It's only one add-on, and not every trapper is going to be able to run this all the time. But this add-on almost eliminates this issue, and I think it's generally very worth it. So the Trapper Sack is the one saving grace for this. The other saving grace is the fact that sometimes the traps are all close together, and you're fast and quick-witted enough to use them well. So if you're very smart and quick, you minimize the problem, and if you have this add-on, you also minimize it. So that's great. Now, the other problem is actually super heartbreaking, and that is the fact that since they've started the whole rework of maps, they have systematically, in the last year or so, all the new and reworked maps have absolutely zero grass. All maps had very luscious, thick patches of grass everywhere. And these have become very anemic, very thin patches of grass. If you play on low settings, you can see right through them, no problem. In the newest map, the Area of Crows, for example, the grass is visible. Like, there's no place in the entire map where the trap will be invisible. So the grass issue on reworked and new maps is just pathetic. If a survivor looks at the ground and they are mildly aware, they will never step on a trap outside of chase. Never. Never. The only exception maybe being a few spots here and there where there's actually good grass in a few maps, or some type of like rubble on the ground that disguises your trap. There's still a few hidden spots here and there. Those are obviously still possible for a survivor to step out of chase. For the most part, you'll need to put traps in loud, obnoxious windows and pallets, or tricky little areas that survivors just don't mentally check. They don't expect traps there. If you do that, then Trapper can still catch people off guard, but no longer do you have the ability to just make everyone paranoid about grass everywhere, because they can just look down, and for the most part, it's incredibly visible. Not to mention all the inter maps that literally do have zero grass, and it's really hard to play around these. When you consider all of this, what is Trapper left with? I think two options for the most part. Number one, bring some decent perks, and he's got a few, to slow down the game and push survivors into a certain playstyle that allows you to set a few traps and then be incredibly precise in how you play and how you push survivors, so that you have a constant back and forth of people stepping into traps, going down, people stepping into traps, putting others in danger, and you win games like this. Or just have one survivor go into the basement and then trap every single living orifice coming out of basement. And that is lame, but it works. If I'm playing Trapper and I have a good basement and someone goes down there, basement hook, trap, and there's no getting through there. Especially with a few add-ons to make the trap disarming longer or make you be able to walk through them. Basement Trapper is still very, very strong. Not every map has a good basement. Not every RNG will allow you to get there. Sometimes you'll just lose because the basement's on the other side and not in the main building, and so on. But when you do get it, and it happens every now and then, it is an almost guaranteed win, or an almost guaranteed situation where survivors really need to sacrifice a lot to get out of there. So in that regard, he's still pretty good, and that hasn't changed much. Overall, though, big maps are rough. Maps without grass are ever more present. Survivors with Dead Heart can still go through your traps. Survivors in comps can still do all kinds of cheeky little things like hold a trap open while another one walks through, disarm your traps every time they see you place one. So it is a killer that basically gets countered by everything strong and everything good in the game. So it's a little bit hard to keep up with survivors at times. Still really fun, and at his best, he is really, really satisfying to play. So please don't be discouraged from trying him out. And next up is Myers. Now, Myers has one of the lower skill ceilings in the game. Unfortunately, there's not a lot to learn or any crazy little tricks to do with him. Essentially, he is a stealth killer with no terrors in tier 1 that can approach survivors almost undetected. In tier 2, he has it's a normal killer with some small bonuses. He has a smaller terror radius, which can sometimes be good, and he vaults slightly faster. And then he can have a temporary tier 3 where he can down survivors in one shot and vaults even quicker, and his terror radius is now normal. It goes without saying that in most maps, his power is not incredibly threatening. There are at least a few structures, in some of them many safe structures, where you can loop him a significant amount Yeah, the occasional bamboozle, yeah, the occasional perk can get in the way, but many palettes and windows are very safe against Myers. So it's really going to come down to you running out of them or you being caught in a bad spot. Or Myers somehow finding you in a bad spot with some info perk and whatnot. Unfortunately, this hasn't changed very much. Myers hasn't aged very well. There's been a few changes to his add-ons, and we're going to comment on them. Overall, his add-ons are okay. He has a very, very large amount of add-ons that are either useless or straight up bad. But if we focus only on the good ones, which we can, we have serviceable add-ons. Some of them make you stock faster. These are always good. A few of them make a tier 3 take a bit longer the first time, but then extend tier 3s very significantly. These are very good, especially the bow. And then there's the very scary infinite tier 3 Myers, which is the less scary against good survivors, mind you, because it takes so long. And perhaps the strongest Tombstone. Not so much the iridescent, but the purple Tombstone fragment, which allows Myers to literally murder a survivor in tier 3 at the cost of losing tier 3. Yeah, these add-ons are pretty nuts, these particular ones. But if we assume that this killer doesn't get carried by if we don't judge this killer based on just one add-on, and we judge it based on the overall, it's really not that crazy. First of all, Myers still needs to get out of tier 1. In some maps, you can do this fairly quickly. In some others, it will be a bit painful. But the thing is, compared to any killer other than maybe Trapper, this is bad. If you're playing Ghostface and 2 survivors make the mistake of doing a gen carelessly in front of you, that's maybe 2 downs, or 1 down now and 1 down later. With Myers, all it means is that you get out of tier 1, you're now a normal killer, and they both get a... Oh, you also stalk them a bunch, so they could now hit the maximum stalk later. So you lost some of your power by doing this, of your maximum power, and now they run away and they begin to loop you. So a good start with Myers is a pathetic start with any other killer. If I'm playing Wraith and I find 2 survivors on a gen and I uncloak and I get nothing out of it and I don't get a hit or a grab or a down or something, I would be like, wow, well, that was bad. Meanwhile, if I'm playing Myers and I get out of tier 2 and 2, so I'm like, yeah, woof, phew, that's so lucky, that's great. Yeah, his early game is pathetic. It's really, really, really bad. Even in the best case scenario, it's still not incredible compared to many other killers. When he's in tier 2, he's a completely predictable normal killer with really nothing threatening to him. One of his best features, though, is the fact that in some maps where it's difficult to see the killer coming, the 60-meter terror radius, along with some perks and other add-ons, can be a bit scary. You can sometimes hear a heartbeat and be immediately harassed by him. Again, this happens more when you're playing solo, much like any stealth killer. The solo versus comms is a big deal. And then in tier 3, okay, he gets a longer launch, which can help a little bit, but it's not that big of a deal. Really not that insane. He is okay, he is serviceable. Now, let's focus on some of these add-ons. Namely, the one that allows you to murder survivors immediately, the Tombstone Fragment, or the Fragrant Tuft of Hair, which makes him infinite tier 3. My opinion of these add-ons is that if you go against a team that has one very weak link, or the team itself is weak, then these add-ons slap, and these add-ons make them lose even harder. If I was playing against a bad team, I would almost rather play Myers than play Pig, even though Pig might be a bit stronger by my standards. With Pig, they could get lucky with the boxes and I could get unlucky. Whereas with Myers, if they have one person that's kind of bad and that person feeds me a lot, I could murder them at 4 gens or 5 gens and then end up winning. So yeah, the ability for Myers to poke at the team and find the one person that's bad with these add-ons and tunnel them out of the game with the Tombstone, or get tier 3 very early and have infinite tier 3 is remarkable. But the moment that you're playing in a bad map against not even good, just decent survivors, these add-ons are going to be not as incredible as you might think. They will be very mild. By the time you get them, you will be in a position where now survivors will just open the gates and get a 2-man escape, or get very, very, you get very mediocre results where other killers would have just performed better overall. And don't forget, these are just a couple add-ons. You take that out of Myers and he's a much more average killer. That admittedly has some okay maps, but that also doesn't do super well in many maps as well. In this day and age, hit and run is hard with medkits and wounds being a thing. He doesn't have any crazy mobility. In fact, it's quite average. And survivors now have Unbreakable and a totem to pick themselves up, mostly Unbreakable. So the whole idea that you would do some time ago of downing one survivor and then going for another and getting multiple downs is incredibly risky to do right now. And I would highly advise against that as a general idea. So with Myers, you'll want to bring the best perks money can buy. And unfortunately, there's a few good ones with him for him right now. And rely on the very stupid strong add-ons, hoping to get something out of them, or the more reliable ones, and having a set of like mind games or an overall gameplay that is just on point for a normal M1 basic killer. And with that, we are now 2 hours 30 into our tier list video, and that about concludes it. I hope that the gameplay in the background was fun to watch, and I hope that you guys had fun with my explanations. Some of these I know for a fact I missed some key things. If you bring them up, I promise you I'm almost sure that I've considered and I just maybe neglected it to mention. Some of these killers have like slight things that are easy to miss, but I did try to consider as many things as possible. And ultimately, many of these killers are really close. When I asked my community about some of these placements, they were literally 50-50. So please, if we disagree, try to understand that it just comes from slight differences and not that you and I have massive disagreements. At the end of the day, all of these killers are fun, and I hope you, with this information in mind, you still have fun playing all of them. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.